Over the years, the Final Fantasy franchise has delivered some of the best games ever made. On Wikipedia's list of video games considered the best, which is decided upon by combing through numerous best of or greatest of all time lists from numerous high-profile publications, Final Fantasy 4, 6, 7, Tactics, and 10 all appear. But you could also add many other games to this list based on their impact, such as Final Fantasy 9, 12, 14, and now Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth. But what if the question was changed? Instead of being plural, what are the best games of all time, it reverts to being singular. Which is the best out of the bunch? That's when things become a bit more divisive. But what if you then added every single major game to the equation, including the numbered entries and major spin-offs? Well, that's what we're going to be looking through today. But instead of sitting here to tell you what we think are the best Final Fantasy games ever, we're going to rely on data instead. As such, we conducted one of our egregious surveys, and after asking almost 2,500 people their thoughts on 57 different Final Fantasy games, we're excited to share the results in full. To explain a bit more, we produced a survey where we listed 57 entries from across the franchise. Those who took the survey were asked to score those games between 1 and 5, with the option also available to state that they hadn't played the game so as to try and remove popularity bias. We've now sorted all of the valid scores, and that forms the basis for this very exhaustive video. In addition, for the mainline entries, we also asked people to contribute 5 words that encapsulated their experience. So when mainline entries do crop up, expect to see a tiny bit more focus. We've actually taken a very similar approach to another project we're working on, our next book. 3 years ago, we crowdfunded a book called The Legacy of the Crystal. It chronicled 135 different Final Fantasy games, many of which are featured in this video. But we then asked the thousands of backers what they wanted to see us work on next, and they chose summons. Our next literary work, dubbed The Guardians of the Crystal, will contain information on the 88 beings that are summonable within the mainline numbered entries. Beyond these excerpts, there will also be gorgeous pieces of art created by some incredible artists there to frame the most iconic entries, and a foreword by Ben Starr, the voice of Clive Rossfield. If you'd like to be notified when the project goes live, you can find a link in the description below or search Guardians of the Crystal on Kickstarter. But with that, let's take a look through the rankings as we run through Final Fantasy games from worst to best, according to you, the viewers. Rock bottom in last place is Final Fantasy All the Bravest. It received a score of 1.88 out of 5, with this score based on the 16% of people who took the survey that actually said they played the game. The placement of All the Bravest, though, is unlikely to surprise anyone. It was released during a period when Square Enix was seeing considerable success from their mobile and social games. As such, they sought to push monetization boundaries further, while attempting to offer alternative sources of enjoyment for their now rather expansive player base. To work towards that objective, Tetsuya Nomura conceived a new type of game that was to be like nothing ever seen before in the franchise. And Square Enix were convinced its unorthodox and expansive gameplay style would resonate with audiences around the world. So much so that they pushed towards a simultaneous global release, as opposed to the typical single-region release strategy for mobile games. What became known as Final Fantasy All the Bravest, shortened to FFATB, was produced by Ichiro Hazama, who at the time had become quite solidified as Square Enix's go-to mobile producer, with Tatsuya Kando and Hiroyuki Ito of Kingdom Hearts fame as opposed to Final Fantasy fame serving as director and co-director respectively. Development was then overseen by a company called Bitgroove, and on paper, what they were creating sounded fun, exciting, and innovative. The classic ATB system was iterated on to create a fast-paced, touch-based battle system, and players were able to unlock and select from over 20 classic job classes. To work in with its designation as a horde battle RPG, the game also contained the largest parties in the history of the franchise, and there were opportunities to level and enhance the party. With Square Enix producing small teasers ahead of the game's release, it led to actually a high degree of expectation for what many hoped would be a solid Final Fantasy mobile experience. But when the game launched, those expectations were shattered, and not in a good way. All the Bravest was panned by critics around the world, with some publications even producing content on top of their regular reviews with a specific focus of strongly encouraging fans of the franchise not to purchase the game. Part of the criticism was around the vanilla gameplay, with players being afforded limited control over what actually happened. The plethora of jobs talked about ahead of the game's release all took the exact same actions every turn, and they were each controlled in the same way, by either tapping or swiping the screen. Characters were also auto-equipped and automatically assigned to parties, meaning much of the game played itself. Further to this, critics and players took exception to how much of the game had been developed to focus on the sole objective of making money. Not only was the game a paid-for product, but it also featured in-app purchases. Premium characters revealed in the build-up, such as Cloud Strife, needed to be bought separately. But to make things worse, it wasn't even possible to select a specific premium character for purchase. Players were just given one at random via a gacha system. On top of this, should a party wipe, then the player was given a choice to either wait 3 minutes per character to try again, or pay money to have them resurrected immediately. It led to an outpouring of vitriol against Square Enix as a company, and they were forced to accept that they had made a huge mistake with not only the game itself, but also how they had chosen to market it to consumers. Still, there were 16 people who took the survey that awarded All the Bravest a perfect score. And it's perhaps because of people like those 16 that All the Bravest ended up having a long and eventful life. Even though it was launched towards the start of 2013, the iOS version wasn't discontinued until over a decade later, in July of 2023. In the penultimate spot, we have Final Fantasy Dimensions 2, with a score of 2.37 out of 5, which is noticeably higher than All the Bravest. Dimensions 2 was also the least played game in the entire survey, with only 8.26% of respondents having admitted to checking the game out. What's curious about this particular game, though, is that when the original Dimensions released in 2010, it represented a significant departure from the other mobile games Square Enix had been producing around that time. Instead of focusing on nostalgia to drive its narrative, Dimensions featured an original story and mechanics, and with Takashi Tokita at the helm, the 8-bit and 16-bit Final Fantasy entries were used as inspiration. For its sequel, Tokita decided to mix things up further. Instead of iterating on the original, what became known as Final Fantasy Legends Crystal of Space-Time in Japan ended up being a wholly different experience from its predecessor. As per Final Fantasy tradition, this saw a brand new cast created, as well as a new world, both of which were loosely based on plans intended for the cancelled Chrono Break. Gameplay also bore almost no resemblance to the original game, with the ATB system replaced by a CTB system, and the extensive job chain system completely removed. It represented a significant risk, but it was one that paid off, at least in the initial sense, but not in the way they had expected. After being a free-to-play game for 2 years, the developers opted to abandon the model, choosing to launch it as a premium app ahead of its global release. However, because it was a free-to-play game repackaged as a premium app, there were teething problems, as the game wasn't really designed for that new format. For example, the stamina system was still retained. It's perhaps for this reason that Dimensions 2, as a concept, did not stand the test of time, and reviews on the Google Play Store aren't too dissimilar to what was seen within this survey. Just above Dimensions 2, we have Dissidia Final Fantasy NT. It received a score of 2.5 out of 5, with around a third of respondents saying they'd played the game. Now, given the wider appeal of Dissidia as a concept, the low placement of NT shows just how much of a bitter taste this game left on fans. After its successful debut on the PlayStation Portable and a subsequent follow-up that received even more critical praise, the Dissidia franchise was in a strong position. Takeo Kujiraoka and Mitsunori Takahashi therefore put forth a proposal to create a new Dissidia game for the PlayStation Vita. But having believed that the Dissidia brand had been taken as far as it could, Tetsuya Nomura vetoed the plan. It was only later, when Ichiro Hazama noted that the concept of Dissidia may prove successful in Japanese arcades, that Nomura was convinced and gave the green light, but only on the premise that they come up with a new concept for the game that could enable Dissidia to break new ground. With the project approved, Koji Ryauka was promoted from his position as battle planning director to director, and Hazama served as producer, and they started drafting plans for this new Dissidia game in 2013. However, due to their experience in the arcade scene, they decided to share responsibilities with a third party, with Team Ninja selected due to their experience working on Dead or Alive. To fulfill Nomura's objective, Dissidia was transitioned from a solo experience to one involving a team. They felt this could add a novel twist on the combat, especially as it was a subtle play on the party mechanic so prevalent throughout the rest of the franchise. To try and make this a smooth transition, the playable cast was nearly identical to what was seen in Dissidia Duodecim, with only a few new characters added, such as Yoshitola from Final Fantasy XIV and Ramza from Final Fantasy Tactics. Upon launch, Dissidia Final Fantasy proved to be a huge success for Square Enix in arcades, with over 3,000 cabinets sold. And due to players being able to save their progress and have it retained when they return, players were encouraged to keep coming back to face new challenges. Expectant fans around the world then geared up for the inevitable home console release, as the game had been produced on a modified PlayStation 4 infrastructure, but they were left waiting for a long time. Dissidia NT, as it became known, didn't release until 2 years after the arcade version. It featured new modes and a story not found in the arcade version. But despite Square Enix attempting to support the game upon launch, Dissidia NT didn't ever take off as intended. The 3 versus 3 combat just didn't translate all that well, and despite numerous modifications being made to the UI, the game wasn't easy to understand for bystanders, and failed to attract any kind of viewership on streaming platforms and in local tournament scenes. Dissidia NT later launched on PC and even went free to play in a bid to try and turn around its ailing fortunes, but by early 2021, proactive support for both the arcade version and the home console version was ceased. With Monster Hunter serving as a huge phenomenon across the Japanese portable gaming scene throughout the 2010s, when Square Enix announced a similar game, there ended up being a lot of excitement and intrigue. But based on where we are in the list, you can probably guess that Final Fantasy Explorers failed to stick the landing, with it receiving a score of just 2.57 out of 5. Despite seeing a huge amount of success for Final Fantasy XI and modest success for Crystal Chronicles, Square Enix had seldom produced Final Fantasy experiences that were based around a party setting that consisted of multiple real-world players. Final Fantasy Explorers was designed to scratch that itch, while also separating itself out from the likes of Monster Hunter, God Eater, and Tukiden. To accomplish this, the development team decided to incorporate classic summons and monsters, while also layering over a comprehensive job system. When the basic concept was shown off, and Ifrit was revealed as the first major boss, alongside classic jobs such as Knight, Monk, Black Mage, and White Mage, it felt like Explorers might not just make a name for itself within the Final Fantasy brand, but also the genre as a whole. Unfortunately, when the game was released, it became apparent that the potential had not been realised. Despite introducing a large volume of summons, an exhaustive list of jobs, and even the ability to masquerade as iconic Final Fantasy characters, everything just felt half-baked and vanilla when compared to already established games in the genre. It meant strong initial sales were followed up by diminishing returns once more and more people learned about the quality of the product. And a similar pattern followed its release outside of Japan, as Explorers received harsh criticism from Western critics, and many were left to wonder about what might have been. One of the more recent entries in the franchise ended up being one of the most genre-defying, but also ill-fated. Yes, next up we have Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier, which scored 2.58 out of 5, and somewhat surprisingly was at least tried by over 1/5 of all respondents. Following the conclusion of the Final Fantasy 30th Anniversary opening ceremony event, Yoshinori Kitase hinted that numerous projects were being created to support the release of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. But very few predicted that Square Enix were going to produce games like The First Soldier. In early 2021, Square Enix filed a trademark for the phrase The First Soldier. At the time, there were rumblings that this name had reference to Sephiroth, and it led to hope that a brand new game was in production that planned to explore Sephiroth's backstory in more detail. However, just a month later, expectant players were given a rather rude awakening, as Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier was announced as a battle royale action game set in Midgar. The immediate response was one of bewilderment. Of all the video game genres to exist, a third-person shooter battle royale was the last anyone expected to be fused with the venerable Final Fantasy brand. A month later, Tetsuya Nomura attempted to explain the decision via an interview with Famitsu, stating that they were attempting to appeal to a new audience. But Nomura also shared that he did not play battle royale games and had no real personal interest in them. Square Enix therefore assigned Shoichi Ichikawa as producer, who was a big fan of the genre, and Nomura noted that this appointment was to ensure that he could still make reckless proposals, knowing that Ichikawa was there to keep them in check. To develop the game and handle its post-launch roadmap, Square Enix then hired a Japanese developer called A-Team. They had worked on many mobile-centric role-playing games, but had never created any kind of action-orientated game before, and they had certainly never created a battle royale experience. They even later noted that The First Soldier was the first time a Japanese developer had ever been placed in charge of a large-scale battle royale project. Needless to say, despite a relatively successful open beta, which highlighted that the game was actually better than expected, and a relatively positive pre-launch which saw over 2 million pre-registrations, The First Soldier suffered from a tumultuous period right after launch. There were horrible server issues, and once players started getting their hands on the game in an uncontrolled manner, cracks began to show. Within weeks of launch, the player base had shrunk so much that bots were making up the majority of the planned 100 players that were meant to feature per round. A-Team continued trying their best to support the game, but even though much of this was cool and led to lots of social media engagement, that did little to help breathe life into the game, and the project ended up being cancelled, with A-Team posting significant losses due to how much the game had underperformed. One of the games that inspired the creation of The First Soldier was another collaborative mobile game that became part of a much wider universe, and that game was Final Fantasy XV: A New Empire, which received a marginally better score of 2.59 out of 5. In the build-up to the launch of Final Fantasy XV, as all eyes were focused on its unfortunate delay, there came a surprising announcement. Alongside the copious amounts of content already revealed as part of either Uncovered or the preceding trade shows, Square Enix issued a press release detailing a partnership that had been agreed with Machine Zone that would see them work together to create a Final Fantasy XV themed mobile MMO. Yosuke Matsuda himself even commented on the partnership, noting that due to Machine Zone's stellar record in the mobile space, which saw them produce games like Game of War and Mobile Strike, that Square Enix were really excited about the partnership. It was high praise indeed, but when Final Fantasy XV: A New Empire launched in June of 2017, the response amongst the gaming community and the fanbase as a whole was quite damning. Final Fantasy XV and Machine Zone's typical design principles had very little in common, and it felt like a game designed to do nothing more than exploit the Final Fantasy brand. Nonetheless, despite some very harsh criticism and constant vitriol against the game, A New Empire turned out to be a huge financial success for Square Enix and Machine Zone. Just 18 months after launch, it had been downloaded more than 50 million times and generated more than $500 million in revenue. This not only made it one of the highest grossing mobile games of all time, but it also rivaled the financial performance of Final Fantasy XV itself, and even led to Machine Zone creating a successor called Final Fantasy XV: War for Eos. Rounding out what seems to be a mini trio of badly scoring Final Fantasy mobile games, next we have Mobius Final Fantasy. This scored 2.6 out of 5, just 0.01 higher than A New Empire. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, given the high-profile nature of the game, it was played by less than 1/5 of those who took the survey. Mobius arrived at a time when Square Enix were in their groove when it came to mobile games, and upon the conclusion of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, Yoshinori Kitase, who was the head of Business Division 1 at the time, decided to be quite pragmatic. Instead of going headfirst into creating another major home console game, they decided to create their own mobile game that was truly befitting of the values of the franchise. This meant that instead of going down the same route as other business divisions by working with a third-party developer and outsourcing the majority of the work, staff were retained from Lightning Returns and moved onto this new project. Motomo Toriyama served as the game's director, with Kitase serving as producer. They were then assisted by many senior figures, with Kazushige Nojima and Daisuke Watanabe overseeing the scenario, Tetsuya Nomura and Toshiyuki Itahana working on art direction, Takeshi Iwabuchi returned as the lead game designer, and the soundtrack was overseen by the likes of Mitsuto Suzuki and Tsuyoshi Sekito. On paper, it was as much of an all-star cast as could have been assembled within Square Enix at the time, but there were also restrictions on the volume of staff available due to the budget being much smaller. And there was also skepticism as to whether or not they could produce a compelling enough experience despite being restricted to mobile devices. The reality was that Western developers had been producing high-quality, visually stunning games like Infinity Blade for many years, but such games were a rarity in the Japanese mobile marketplace, and the main challenge was whether or not the team could transition effectively away from their proprietary Crystal Tools engine to using something more standard in the Unity engine. From the outset, the team had decided to make Mobius Final Fantasy a modern take on classic elements. This meant the story focused on the Warrior of Light, but to modernize it, the protagonist was affectionately called Wool. Mobius also moved away from the fast-paced action by adopting a tactical turn-based battle system, and at its core featured the most comprehensive job system ever seen in the franchise. Similar to other games released around the same time, Kitase had planned for Mobius to have a global launch, but they realized that ambition created complications. Due to the tight control on budget and a desire to oversee almost every part of the game's production themselves, there became a realization that launching in Japan first would allow them to iron out the kinks in a more controlled manner. It led to the global version of the game being delayed by over a year, and when it released, they tried to speed up the pipeline to compensate. Upon launch, the similarities with Final Fantasy XIII were very clear from a visual perspective, but Mobius had achieved that initial objective. It won numerous awards for its visual style, and the developers managed to keep players engaged with compelling collaboration events, some of which even ended up being quite detailed due to the staff members involved. However, there was also a sense that even though the story was quite compelling, other aspects of the game were not. There just wasn't enough content to keep everyone engaged between the releases of each story episode. It meant that even though Mobius was downloaded over 20 million times, its revenue paled in comparison to its contemporaries, and the game was shut down in 2020 after many of its core staff, including Toriyama and Naoki Hamaguchi, were moved over to work on the Final Fantasy VII Remake. The next entry sees our first mainline entry appear. Yes, unfortunately, Final Fantasy II, the so-called black sheep of the mainline entry family, scored only 2.667 out of 5 and takes up the spot of being the lowest rated mainline game. Following the huge success of the original Final Fantasy, the entire fortunes of Square shifted almost overnight, and individuals who were considering even walking away from the video games industry, such as Hironobu Sakaguchi, were convinced to stay. The company knew they needed to provide a follow-up so as to capitalize on the success of the first game, but there was just one problem. There had never been any thought given to the what happens next scenario, and other properties had been released on the market by rival developers that were already bigger and better. As such, after the decision had been made and Sakaguchi was tasked with creating a follow-up, he realized that he was creatively spent. And to make matters worse, his long-term development partner and friend, Hiromichi Tanaka, felt much the same. Neither had any grand vision for the project and were suffering from mental and physical exhaustion. Their initial plan was therefore to make something quick and easy. This would have seen Final Fantasy II serve as a straight sequel, with numerous game design elements inherited from the original game and a narrative where the Warriors of Light would return to defeat a new threat that had emerged. This was meant to be a very safe option, and it would have been in keeping with what other franchises had done to try and maintain a similar volume of sales from one iteration to the next. But the franchises that wanted to grow so as to become something more were ambitious and adopted bolder approaches. Unsure as to the best way to proceed, Sakaguchi opened up the floor to the team. If they wanted Final Fantasy to make a real splash and grow to be a true competitor to Dragon Quest, he accepted that playing it safe was not the right option. After all, Square had tried this countless times before, and they had only succeeded with Final Fantasy by doing the exact opposite of what was expected. However, as they had no fresh ideas themselves for how this could be accomplished with Final Fantasy II, there was a hope that maybe someone in the wider team had ideas they were passionate about and wanted to share. As it turns out, someone did, and that someone was Akitoshi Kawazu. Kawazu proposed a rather outlandish vision for Final Fantasy II, which was planned to retain the DNA of the first game, but also step out from the shadows of its predecessor. This meant that Final Fantasy II retained the same core battle system, with minor enhancements made to ensure it evolved in an appropriate manner. And a similar decision was taken around naming conventions of spells and equipment. These too were kept consistent to ensure the game felt familiar to existing fans. Everything else, however, was fair game for change. It meant there were wholesale changes to the scenario and how it was delivered, and significant modifications were also made to many of the game's core mechanics, with a specific focus around character progression. When Final Fantasy II launched in Japan at a higher price point to the original no less, it sold almost 50% more copies than its predecessor. The media also offered high praise, with Famitsu giving it a higher score than the original game, something that also saw it sweep Best RPG, Best Scenario, and Game of the Year. Time, however, has not been kind to Final Fantasy II, and this was not helped by failed attempts to localize the game. By the time those localizations happened, certain expectations had been gained about what a Final Fantasy game should be, and Final Fantasy II did not fit inside that box. It did, however, serve as a foundation for the Saga franchise, with Romancing Saga very much seen as a spiritual successor for what Kawazu was attempting to achieve with Final Fantasy II. Now, as part of the survey, we asked people to explain how they felt about Final Fantasy II in just 5 words, and the common words and themes were interesting concept, ambitious and experimental, but also flawed, badly executed, weird, and frustrating. Following on from Final Fantasy II, we have our first entry from the Crystal Chronicles franchise, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles: The Crystal Bearers. This game was given a 2.674 out of 5, placing it marginally ahead of Final Fantasy II. For some time, Crystal Chronicles have been identified as a sub-franchise that could be built out and expanded upon, and after the release of the original game on the GameCube, this saw countless other properties produced, many of which served as direct extensions of the original concept. There was a yearning to push forward, however, and at E3 2005, it was announced that a new Crystal Chronicles game was in development for the Revolution, which was later renamed as the Nintendo Wii. Toshiyuki Itahana was installed as director, with Akitoshi Kawazu overseeing production. And from the outset, the plan was to deviate from the typical Crystal Chronicles formula to make a more traditional single-player experience that placed more emphasis on story and was able to take advantage of the Wiimote to create a unique style of gameplay. It was an interesting premise, but the Crystal Bearers was marred by development issues, and between its announcement and eventual release, 5 other Crystal Chronicles games ended up being brought to market. When the game was eventually released, due to how much the industry, and indeed Crystal Chronicles, had moved on, the vision just did not resonate with the public who had become burnt out on the sub-franchise. This unfortunate scenario led to the Crystal Bearers only selling 1/3 of its original shipment, highlighting the perils of oversaturation and long development times. However, there were still those who thought the game had merit, and even though only 11% of those who took the survey said they played the game, 25 of them felt strongly enough to give the Crystal Bearers a perfect score. Rounding out the 10 least liked Final Fantasy games, we unfortunately have another mobile game, War of the Visions: Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, which received a score of 2.7 out of 5. On paper, War of the Visions should have been perfect, and it was very much set up that way. Due to the huge financial success of Brave Exvius within the first few years of its launch, Square Enix were encouraged to expand its premium spin-off mobile application with a spin-off of its own. It became known as War of the Visions: Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, and it was unveiled to the world as part of Brave Exvius' 3rd anniversary celebration. From the outset, it was clear that War of the Visions was to be a very different kind of game, as both Square Enix and Gumi, the parent company of Alim, attempted to ensure that it was a complementary experience as opposed to a replacement or a successor. To ensure this was achieved in a satisfactory manner, unlike Brave Exvius, which was largely entrusted to Alim with supervision from Square Enix, War of the Visions was co-developed by Square Enix and Gumi. And to ensure it had the greatest chance of success, Square Enix drew from one of their oldest and most successful spin-off franchises, Final Fantasy Tactics, while Gumi drew from one of their more successful prior releases, The Alchemist Code. By taking this approach, War of the Visions created an interesting fusion that, by featuring a different style of gameplay, as well as a different overarching theme and presentation, allowed it to have a high degree of separation from Brave Exvius. This approach led to a significant amount of intrigue and attention pre- and post-launch, with War of the Visions downloaded 3 million times within just 10 days of its Japanese launch. 3 months later, that figure was up to 9 million, and the number of downloads only continued to grow following the game's global launch, which happened only 5 months later, much quicker than previous games released outside of Japan. However, despite the huge financial success of War of the Visions, which saw it become one of the most popular and highest grossing games in Japan, it wasn't without its criticisms. The monetization strategy implemented within the game was considered to be one of the most aggressive and predatory to date, and it left a bad taste in the mouths of those who actually enjoyed or wanted to enjoy the game. The gacha system was so bad that the Consumer Affairs Agency of Japan even got involved due to the unfair manipulation of lottery results. They ordered Square Enix and Gumi to soften their practices and make the game fairer for paying consumers, and threatened sanctions if they did not self-regulate properly. In 47th position, we have Final Fantasy Mystic Quest with a score of 2.71 out of 5. Mystic Quest arrived at an interesting time for the franchise, as even though Final Fantasy was now well established in Japan, Square had struggled to effectively build the brand in North America. This in itself was somewhat ironic, because this scenario was of Square's own making. When the original Final Fantasy had launched in North America, it sold more copies than when it launched in Japan. The challenge, however, was that the localization process had taken 2.5 years. So by the time Final Fantasy did launch in North America, in Japan, they had already released Final Fantasy III and were in the early stages of developing the next 2 games. Plans were drawn up to localize Final Fantasy II and III, but they ended up being shelved for numerous reasons. And this then meant that when Final Fantasy IV launched in North America 15 months later as Final Fantasy II, fans in that region experienced a game that had similarities to the original, but was also very different. They had missed out on how the franchise had evolved. Japanese-style role-playing games had also not had the same renaissance during that time. In Japan, the initial launch of Dragon Quest had been huge, with countless games being released to capitalize on this emerging genre by other publishers. But in North America, role-playing games, at least on home consoles, were nowhere near as popular. This was, in part, due to there being fewer releases, but there was also less fanfare. When the home console role-playing game genre was developing in Japan, there was a concerted amount of effort spent on marketing and education. It took well over a year before audiences were convinced through a combination of editorial content and word of mouth, but in North America, there just wasn't the same level of exposure. And with Final Fantasy only having one release on the Famicom and Dragon Warrior having nowhere near the same impact when it launched in that region, the foundation wasn't present when Final Fantasy IV then launched. Its sales therefore ended up being much lower than the original Final Fantasy. With the latest installment selling so poorly, there was a belief that they just hadn't done a good enough job to help North Americans with the transition. Despite their best efforts, the game was too confusing for them to understand and too difficult to navigate. The board of Square therefore decided that releasing another mainline entry in North America would be tantamount to a terrible idea, as it had the potential to confuse the audience even further and start to create a negative brand sentiment. Instead, they decided it was best to train North Americans to better appreciate and understand how and why Final Fantasy was evolving, so that when the next major follow-up was released, it wouldn't be so jarring. And it was this initiative that led to the creation of Mystic Quest. Development was overseen by Square Osaka, who had never worked on a Final Fantasy game before, but they had worked on Saga 3, so decided to have Mystic Quest be a natural evolution of that game. Throughout development, they attempted to make the game as catered to North Americans as they could, but they only had limited exposure to that market, and a lot of their feedback came from employees in the North American office who were, of course, not even the target demographic. As the story of the original game had resonated, they also decided to retell that same story, but make it even more simple. And they made sure that the artwork had bright and contrasting colours, and that everything related to progression was as signposted as possible, so as to avoid any potential frustration or confusion. When the game launched, it did end up selling more copies than Final Fantasy IV, but it also sold at a lower price point, so ended up generating around 25% less revenue. And given the initial objective, this meant Mystic Quest ended up as a significant disappointment for the company. Next, we have Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Echoes of Time, which scored 2.72 out of 5. Echoes of Time served as the third major iteration into the Crystal Chronicles franchise, and Square decided to make some big changes under the hood. Unlike the previous two games, this meant that not only was Echoes of Time planned to launch on two systems simultaneously, it was to also feature crossplay, enabling someone on the Nintendo DS to play in the same instance as someone playing on the Nintendo Wii. No developer had ever achieved such a feat before, and to facilitate this feat of innovation, Square Enix developed what became known as the Pollux engine. The goal was accomplished, but when Echoes of Time launched, players found that the implementation left a lot to be desired. When Square Enix had announced their ambitions, there had been an expectation that the Wii was to be the lead platform as it featured much higher hardware specifications. But upon launch, it was revealed that Square Enix had done the exact opposite. The Nintendo DS had been prioritized as the primary platform, perhaps due to the base they built with Rings of Fate. There was nothing inherently wrong with this approach, except the Wii version just ended up being an upscaled version of the DS version, and there was very little attempt to try and hide this. As a result, Echoes of Time was not very well received, and its sales were poor across both platforms. As Square Enix sought to assert themselves and take advantage of the burgeoning mobile space, they looked to develop a few different properties, and one of them, called Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, saw them partner with an already established player called Gumi. Gumi, who operated the Grease social platform, had seen massive success through a game called Brave Frontier. It was downloaded over 10 million times within a year of its release, and seemed to be going from strength to strength. And given that Brave Frontier was itself inspired by the likes of Final Fantasy, Romancing Saga, and Star Ocean, it felt like the perfect partnership. Brave Exvius was overseen by the same leadership team who had worked on Brave Frontier, but they were tasked with significantly evolving what they had produced before, while also fusing in prominent parts of the Final Fantasy franchise. It saw Brave Exvius feature a turn-based battle system that built upon the chain system seen in Brave Frontier, and players were able to call upon special summon characters from previous Final Fantasy games. Story was also given a specific mandate, with initial focus on Rain as well as his companion Laswell. By fusing these elements together, Brave Exvius iterated on an already successful formula, and within 2 weeks of its launch, it had already been downloaded over 3 million times. 8 months later, coinciding with its global launch, it had been downloaded 7 million times. From this point onwards, Brave Exvius did not slow down for some time. It has since been downloaded over 48 million times, and due to the breadth of its player base, Square Enix were even able to host in-person fan festas around the world. Brave Exvius also had its own 3-hour musical produced in Japan, while also partnering with the likes of Katy Perry and Ariana Grande. But it hasn't all been positive. Even though the story did receive numerous compliments, aggressive monetization has been called out, and this only got more pronounced over time as the game needed to keep on generating revenue despite its active player base decreasing. As of right now, this has seen Square Enix choose to shut down the global version of the game, but the Japanese version is still operating some 9 years after its initial release. In 44th place, we have Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Ring of Fates, with a score of 2.75 out of 5, only marginally better than Echoes of Time. One of the aims Square had when creating Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was that the game would sell well enough to break off and spawn its own franchise, without needing to use the Final Fantasy brand, much like Saga and Mana had done many years prior. Unfortunately, even though the game ended up as the 26th best-selling game to release on the GameCube, the consensus at the now Square Enix was that Crystal Chronicles was not a strong enough brand, so subsequent installments continued to feature the Final Fantasy name. The first follow-up, which was given the subtitle of Ring of Fates, was produced for the Nintendo DS due to its dual-screen functionality. This perfectly replicated the functionality of the original game, where the second screen was only possible by attaching a Game Boy Advance via the link cable. Effort was also placed around ensuring the single-player campaign was much stronger, as this was one of the main points of contention with the original game. Upon launch though, despite being released on a console with a much larger install base, and with Japan going through a huge period of people wanting to play handheld multiplayer experiences, Ring of Fates failed to exceed the sales of Crystal Chronicles, and many felt it was an inferior experience. In 43rd, we have Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, with a score of 2.81 out of 5. Following the merger between Square and Enix, Yoichi Wada steadied the ship before extolling the virtues of his plan for future growth. Central to this plan was the concept of creating polymorphic content, which was designed to work towards the goal of strengthening Square Enix's intellectual property in a way that was beyond traditional entertainment. In the past, IP had often been siloed to the original medium, with other mediums just used to tell the same story. For example, throughout the 90s, there was a plethora of licensed video games that were adaptations of movies. Wada envisioned something beyond this, whereby supplemental projects were created to empower the IP and increase its value. The compilation of Final Fantasy VII ended up being Square Enix's first major attempt at creating polymorphic content, and Dirge of Cerberus, which arrived in 2006, was perhaps one of the most unorthodox pieces of the puzzle. After seeing their success building over time, Yoshinori Kitase had become fascinated by first-person shooters and their huge financial and critical success. Medal of Honor and Half-Life were two specific sources of inspiration, and Kitase dreamt of a world where he could create a hybrid experience that blended the typical action-orientated experience with the role-playing elements that they as a company were known for. He felt this hybrid game could play to their strength as developers, but Kitase also surmised that it would be more digestible for Japanese gamers, who at the time were still struggling to acclimatise to the twin-stick evolution of the action genre. In the initial sense, the game was not tied to the compilation, but after running through the roster of characters that wielded guns, such as Barrett, Irvine and Yuna, they settled on Vincent Valentine, as Kitase had always wanted to expand his story. As development continued, a story was created that expanded on Vincent's relationship with Hojo and Lucrezia, and also introduced a whole other side of Shinra known as Deep Ground. The game also morphed from being a first-person shooter to a third-person shooter. But behind the scenes, the developers were struggling to deliver a game that was of the same standard as Western titles in the same genre. The game ended up being delayed and delayed again, missing its initial launch window, and the planned beta tests around the game's proposed multiplayer component never happened due to them having to spend more time improving the game as a core function. Unfortunately, Dirge of Cerberus struggled to find its footing in Japan upon launch. However, there was hope that it was simply because of a lack of affinity with the genre in that region, and that Western gamers would be more attuned. Numerous tweaks were even made in the build-up to the Western version, such as making the game play 1.2 times faster, adding double jump, and giving Vincent the ability to shoot while in the air. They also added extra hard difficulty and access to a ton of optional missions. But the response was the same when it launched in North America and Europe as it had been in Japan. But perhaps the negative reactions have softened over time given its position on this list. Next, we have Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, which received a score of 2.87 out of 5. This sees it granted 42nd position on the list and ranks it as the lowest scoring part of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. When the team were working on Final Fantasy XIII-2, they already had in their minds that the story was going to continue beyond that piece of the project. It was for this reason that the game was given a cliffhanger ending, with their plan to deliver the true ending and a fitting conclusion to Lightning's story via a piece of downloadable content called Requiem of the Goddess. But outside of concluding Lightning's arc, it also teased the potential for a third game. With the response to Final Fantasy XIII-2 being satisfactory enough, a third game was then given the green light. But unlike the previous two games, this was to be given a much shorter development cycle because they wanted it to launch while A, the story was still fresh, and B, before the next console generation arrived. The initial plan was to simply call the game Final Fantasy XIII-3, but they felt this may hinder sales, so they opted for Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII as they felt it had the potential to draw in more first-time players, while also representing the narrative theme of being reborn. With the turnaround time being so short, the decision was also taken to focus solely on Lightning. This cut down the volume of assets required and the battle system was scaled down. But to counter this, they created a whole new world with a collection of original NPCs. In the end, Lightning Returns launched less than 2 years after XIII-2, but it ended up being divisive due to how many changes were made to both the combat, but also general game design, with a time-based narrative device not resonating with everyone. Still, it was the very things that made it divisive that also helped to make it appeal to pockets of the fanbase. And one of the interesting aspects of the survey was that Lightning Returns received the highest relative percentage of 1 out of 5 reviews compared to all other home console games, but it was still ranked as a perfect game by 14% of those who had played it. In 41st position, we have the original Crystal Chronicles, with a score of 2.9 out of 5, and this also places it as the highest Crystal Chronicles property on this list. The game itself arrived at an interesting time for Square. After turning their back on Nintendo to produce Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation, relations between the two companies were at absolute rock bottom. This was fine for a few years, but as Square started to enter into financial difficulties, they needed to find ways to bring in extra revenue with maximum profitability. They had already released quite a few of their older games for the PlayStation, but with the Game Boy Advance doing particularly well in the handheld space, they wanted to port their games to that system too. Nintendo, however, did not forget what had happened in the past and rejected this proposal. Out of desperation, Square were instead forced to partner with Bandai, something that saw them support the launch of the WonderSwan Color with a complete 16-bit remake of the original Final Fantasy. But even though returns were good, they weren't what Square needed, so they continued to try and negotiate with Nintendo. In the end, a compromise was met, but the terms of the deal were not favourable to Square, not least because Sony had just bought a 19% stake in their company. Nintendo would allow Square to port their back catalogue to the Game Boy Advance, but only if they first produced an exclusive original game for that system, but also for the GameCube. So that both Nintendo and Sony were appeased, Square then established a new studio called the Game Designer Studio, where Akitoshi Kawazu was the majority shareholder. But it was nothing more than a paper company, with the actual development being done by Kawazu's production unit within Square. The other aspect was that due to Square's financial situation, they couldn't really afford to dedicate resources to creating a brand new game for the GameCube, so they accepted funding from the president of Nintendo on the proviso that their game was produced within just 1 year. On the surface, this seemed like an insurmountable task, as they had never worked with this Nintendo infrastructure before, but Nintendo were not heartless, and gave them access to some of their top creative talent, such as Shigeru Miyamoto. After doing so, they realised that to take advantage of the new hardware and also hit their deadline, Crystal Chronicles would need to have their story play out using the in-game engine as opposed to pre-rendered cinematics, and that the story would need to be condensed compared to a typical mainline game. But they also saw opportunities for the game to innovate, and this led to the decision to create a multiplayer experience that could leverage both the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube at the same time, something that had never been done before. By the end of production, they had created something that was unlike any prior Final Fantasy experience, and Crystal Chronicles was even awarded the grand prize at the Japan Media Arts Festival. However, for all its merits as a multiplayer game, Crystal Chronicles struggled as a single-player experience, and this held it back from becoming a killer application for the console. The recent remaster was also a huge stain on the original due to its implementation, and this combination of factors may explain why Crystal Chronicles was one of the most divisive games on this survey, with an equal number of players scoring it as a 1 out of 5 as there were players scoring it as a 5 out of 5. In 40th position, we have Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings with a score of 4.914 out of 5. And this is a very curious game. In the early planning stages of this project, which was helmed by Motomo Toriyama, it was meant to be a standalone game that had nothing to do with Final Fantasy XII whatsoever. None of the senior team overseeing the project had ever worked on an Ivalice property, and their initial plan was to create a simplistic fusion game that could serve as an introduction to the Final Fantasy franchise, while also branching out into the strategy subgenre. However, as development progressed, Akitoshi Kawazu, who had taken over as the de facto brand manager for Ivalice following the departure of Matsuno, sensed an opportunity to work in with the new company directive and create some much beloved polymorphic content. Based around this, instead of trusting that the new game would be able to stand on its own 2 feet as an innovative Final Fantasy strategy spin-off in the same way that Tactics had done a decade before, Kawazu decided the team should shoehorn in elements of Final Fantasy XII so they could rebrand it as a connected game, as he believed this would make the game sell better and provide fans of that universe with a consistent output of supplemental material. For that reason, Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings has never been considered a sequel by Square Enix. They see it more as a Final Fantasy XII spin-off, and this is why it was not called Final Fantasy XII 2. To work in with Kawazu's objectives, many of the mechanics of Final Fantasy XII were adapted to this new genre. The gambit system, for example, was made much less complicated, as only one gambit could be assigned to a character, and quickenings were also retained and reduced in scope. Despite the developers trying their best, however, to make a property that was worthy of featuring the Final Fantasy XII name, Revenant Wings struggled to find a place for itself amongst the roster of Final Fantasy games being released around that time, and even though around 1 million copies were sold, this represented only a small fraction of those who had purchased Final Fantasy XII. Moving on to 39th position, we have Final Fantasy Dimensions, which scored 2.915 out of 5, a mere 0.001 higher than Revenant Wings. Dimensions arrived at a time when Square Enix were still finding their feet with mobile gaming. They had experimented with a few different formats, but the most successful had been producing episodic games like Before Crisis and Final Fantasy IV The After Years. Based on this, the decision was taken to create another episodic game, but Takashi Tokita, who had overseen The After Years, also set out to create a game that was much grander in scope than either of the 2 previous properties. But beyond that, he wanted to harken back to the olden days of the franchise and create a new game that would serve as a modern extension of the 8-bit and 16-bit era. It was for this reason that Dimensions included a job chain system and featured a similar graphical style, with Kazuko Shibuya providing the pixel art, just as she did for many of the Final Fantasy games of that era. When it launched, the first chapter was made free, with subsequent chapters then made available for individual purchase. But due to the new format, Tokita and his team of scenario writers took a novel approach of only completing part of the story at launch, as opposed to mapping out the entire project. They did, of course, have a rough plan, but none of the characters had predetermined fates, and they, as a team, had no idea how the game was going to end. Instead, they chose to adapt to player feedback, and this had a direct influence on how the story progressed and then ultimately concluded. By the end of its run, Dimensions had a story that lasted around 50 hours, far greater than any of its contemporaries, and for the most part, it was also good. Due to its success, Dimensions was then ported to smartphones and made into a standalone project so that players didn't have to wait for specific cadences of time to pass before being able to enjoy the next chapter in the story. Sitting 1 position higher, the 38th highest ranking game was Final Fantasy Record Keeper, with a score of 2.93 out of 5. As Square Enix continued to evolve their mobile offerings, they embarked on creating a whole host of newer generation games that took advantage of gacha mechanics, as opposed to paid episodic content, while also offering a more holistic gameplay experience. Amongst these games were Mobius and Brave Exvius, but the forerunner was a game called Final Fantasy Record Keeper. Having collaborated with Square Enix on numerous projects before, DNA pitched a brand new game idea. They had seen great success with a project called Defender of Teal and sought to replicate and build upon this by creating a similar game that incorporated Final Fantasy elements. This proposition appealed to Square Enix as it looked to address a clear deficiency within their existing roster of mobile games. They had never managed to gain a foothold in North America or Europe, with their games often met with considerable criticism. But Record Keeper had the potential to reverse that trend, just like Defender of Teal had done for DNA before. To ensure it had the best chance of succeeding, Square Enix themselves oversaw the majority of the game's design elements, which included the gameplay, story, world building, and the creation of original characters. DNA were then left in charge of creating a back-end infrastructure and monetization strategies to ensure they could launch globally without issue, while generating vast sums of revenue. When Record Keeper launched in its respective regions, it ended up being well received. Initial download figures and revenue exceeded any previous Square Enix release of a similar nature, and such had been its success that Record Keeper persevered for a considerable period of time before it was eventually shut down in 2022. In 37th position, we have Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, with a score of 2.96 out of 5. After working on remakes for Final Fantasy 3 and 4 for the Nintendo DS, Takashi Tokita wanted to create an original property within the Final Fantasy brand that was meant to modernize older elements while building on what they had already accomplished. That game became The Four Heroes of Light. And to work towards the objective, the development team iterated on the job system from Final Fantasy 3 to create the Crown system. It featured classic jobs such as Black Mage, White Mage, and Fighter, but to keep the experience feeling fresh, a whole host of new jobs were created, including Seamstress and Party Host. They also had the story focus on Four Heroes of Light, a game paying tribute to those earlier games. But to reference what had been done with the 3 remake, they were no longer nameless. They also fused in other elements from Final Fantasy 1 and 2, as well as Dragon Quest 1 through 3, while also introducing unique elements such as the action point system. These references helped to provide a solid structure, but due to there being a new story and new mechanics that needed to be refined, as well as the inclusion of a multiplayer aspect that would allow 4 players to wirelessly connect and fight monsters together in the same party, the team encountered difficulties that they just weren't used to facing when working on the remakes, and it led to numerous internal delays throughout production. When the Four Heroes of Light launched, there was an appreciation for what the development team had created due to how respectful the game was to the past, but also how well the older games had been iterated upon. The response encouraged the team to start working on a sequel, but it never came to pass, and was instead morphed into another project called Bravely Default. The game occupying the 36th spot is Final Fantasy Type 0, and by proxy, also Final Fantasy Type 0 HD, and they received a score of 2.98 out of 5. For many years, Type 0 was seen as some kind of messiah amongst the community. It was originally revealed as Final Fantasy Agato 13 at E3 2006 as a game designed exclusively for Japanese mobile devices. But at that point, only a single piece of key art had been created. What followed was a rather tumultuous development cycle. The mobile version was cancelled in 2008, with the game said to instead be planned for the PlayStation Portable. But by 2011, there were still no major updates on what was happening with the game. Later that year, however, Agato 13 was rebranded to Type 0, and even though it retained shared mythology with Fabula Nova Crystallis, the connection with Final Fantasy XIII was removed. Despite all this, there was still a lot of curiosity about Type 0, and when it launched, it received a 39 out of 40 from Famitsu, and became one of the best-selling PlayStation Portable games to ever launch in Japan. Because of this, the curiosity in the West was further piqued. However, there was no forthcoming announcement relating to localization, and as the PSP era came and went, Type 0 remained locked as a Japanese exclusive. That was until Hajime Tabata saw an opportunity. After taking over development of Final Fantasy Versus 13, he oversaw its transition to Final Fantasy 15, The second, Fabula Nova Crystallis property to go through a significant overhaul under his watch. Part of the strategy to bring the community back on side was to create a playable demo for the game, but they also wanted players to experience Type 0. So they decided to kill two birds with one stone by porting Type 0 to current generation home consoles and packaging in a demo of Final Fantasy XV. Even though this port did see some significant enhancements, it was still ultimately a PlayStation Portable game, and design practices that were acceptable and often expected on handheld consoles didn't translate so well. Despite this, many did resonate with the story of Type 0, and there's a lot of love for its theme tune. 35th, we have one of the more recent entries in the franchise, Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, which scored 3.02 out of 5. Shortly after Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced, Yoshinori Kitase went on record as saying that although there weren't any concrete plans for how they were going to further expand the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, they were planning to create a handful of games that they hoped would be able to sustain interest between the various installments in the main arc. As we've already covered, the first of these games was The First Soldier, which Square Enix no doubt hoped would last for a few years, or at least long enough for their second property, Ever Crisis, to release. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, as The First Soldier had its service terminated within 12 months of its launch, and this then placed even more pressure on Ever Crisis to succeed. Fans had to wait almost another year for the launch of Ever Crisis, and there was a decent amount of excitement. After all, the trailers promised another chance for a remake, and the visual style was more akin to the original game, with it also featuring a turn-based combat system. There was also the promise of the original compilation being retold, including Advent Children and Before Crisis, and this served as quite the carrot. Upon launch, the immediate perception around Ever Crisis was that it looked pretty, but also featured incredibly aggressive monetization. The array of stories offered were also an interesting choice, as introductory chapters for Final Fantasy VII and Crisis Core were sidelined by a huge focus on expanding the story of characters who were only just introduced to the franchise via The First Soldier. Since then, however, Ever Crisis has managed to find a dedicated audience, and although its revenue performance has by no means been stellar in comparison to games such as Brave Exvius, War of the Visions or Opera Omnia, it has still been decent enough to make sure Ever Crisis avoided the dreaded termination within 12 months that has plagued so many other mobile titles released by Square Enix over the past decade. Ranked in 34th position is Final Fantasy IV The After Years, with a score of 3.06 out of 5. This project was born from a desire for Square Enix to start producing supplemental content around their existing properties that could further engage audiences who wanted more. And with a Final Fantasy IV remake in full production for the Nintendo DS, it felt like the perfect property to explore with this model. By working on the remake, Takashi Tokita, who had penned the scenario for the original game, realised how attached he was to the main characters. And when he was approached about expanding their stories to explore what happened after the conclusion of the original game, he felt it was the right time to not just see how the main characters had grown, but also to introduce new characters and build upon the lore he had helped to create so many years before. Due to how much time had passed, Tokita came up with the concept for what in Japan was called Final Fantasy IV The After, as he wanted fans of the original game to view a story that mirrored their own lives, as he felt many would have grown up to become parents. They tried to keep other aspects of the game as similar as possible though, incorporating an ATB system and having Kazuko Shibuya return to create designs for both new characters and old ones. The main difference, however, came in terms of how the game was distributed. Given the huge success of some of Square's episodic games, The After Years was designed to follow the same approach. An introductory episode was offered for free, with each new character episode releasing every 3 to 4 weeks after, and within 2 years, over 4.5 million episodes had been purchased, despite heavy criticism for how disjointed the experience felt. The After Years was then ported over to WiiWare in its original 2D format, before Square Enix then worked on a brand new 3D remake to ensure it was in line with what had been created for the original game. The next entry sees our second mainline game appear, In 33rd position, that means we have the 2D version of Final Fantasy III, with a score of 3.09 out of 5. Similar to Final Fantasy II, even though there were plans to localize Final Fantasy III for the NES, it took many years before gamers outside of Japan were able to experience this game due to countless issues that were compounded on top of each other. Had Final Fantasy III released as intended, players may have viewed it more fondly than they have through the lens of time, as in many ways, it was an evolved version of the original Final Fantasy that incorporated some of the finer quality of life improvements that were made with Final Fantasy II. And this was due to a shift in mentality. Unlike Final Fantasy II, development on Final Fantasy III was a much more straightforward affair, at least in principle. Whereas there had never been any plans to extend the franchise back in 1987, after the release of Final Fantasy II in 1988, expansion was almost certain, assuming sales matched, or indeed exceeded, those posted by the first iteration. Based on this, the team already had a loose plan for what they needed to do. They knew that an original story needed to be crafted, and that the story needed to be set in an original world focused on a brand new troupe of characters. They also knew that this original story then needed to come complete with lore that helped to distinguish it from the previous two games. Based around this, they decided to try and iterate on the story of the original Final Fantasy and just add more depth. For other elements, the team had a bit more flexibility. After work commenced on Final Fantasy II, underlying principles had been established for what design elements needed to be present in order for a game to be defined as a Final Fantasy game. For Final Fantasy III, the team just needed to identify which principles they wanted to adopt, thus enabling them to focus their efforts with regards to the evolution of existing concepts and how much time they could spend on the creation of new ones. And in this regard, they chose jobs. Instead of the player selecting their job at the beginning of the game, this meant characters were now able to learn jobs as the game progressed, while also being able to switch between them to adapt to the changing needs of the environments they were encountering and the bosses they faced. For the time, these advancements were quite significant, and Final Fantasy III ended up becoming the first game in the series to sell over 1 million copies in Japan. However, the same level of praise and affection has never been garnered outside of Japan, no doubt because it took Square Enix, due to countless issues, over 30 years for the 2D version of the game to be made available for people to play outside of Japan. As part of this, numerous remakes and ports were cancelled, including for the WonderSwan Color and the Game Boy Advance. The 2D version was also put aside in favour of the 3D remake. It wasn't until the Pixel Remaster Collection released that Final Fantasy III became available, but by this point, most people were playing the game at face value, as opposed to remembering what it was like to experience the game during their childhoods. In 32nd position, we have Final Fantasy XI, which was only played by just under a quarter of the people who took this survey. Those who did play, however, scored it as a 3.1 out of 5, and it feels like this typifies the journey of Square's first MMO. When Final Fantasy XI was announced during the Square Millennium event, it was met with a mixed response. Up until that point, Square had become synonymous with producing offline RPGs that contained rich narratives and compelling gameplay mechanics, and it was difficult for people to see how this would translate into the realm of MMOs. Yet that was the challenge. Square had to show that Final Fantasy could work as an MMO, but the first step was to actually convince themselves it was even possible. The reality was that none of the staff had ever made a game in this genre, and few even had exposure to the genre. But that wasn't a good enough reason for Sakaguchi to believe they couldn't succeed. After all, they had also worked on Parasite Eve, Final Fantasy Tactics, Einhander, and the Tobal franchise, and each had been considered hits in their respective genres. He therefore convinced Hiromichi Tanaka and Koichi Ishii to helm the project, due to how important they were in establishing Final Fantasy during the 8-bit era. The overriding goal was to create a game that had the ability to connect cultures around the world. And to accomplish this, Ishii decided that they should focus their efforts on activities and structures that promoted teamwork, and how knowledge and possessions could flow throughout the game and in the real world. These fundamental tenets of design had a huge impact on those who then played the game, as it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. the extreme principles created lasting bonds, as people generally wanted to help other people succeed and overcome the game's numerous obstacles. But those same principles also made it a hard game to like, with the joy only coming after hours upon hours of near torture. Final Fantasy XI, though, was a trailblazer in the space, and by the time it launched in North America, it had not only recouped its development costs, but was turning a massive profit due to its subscriber base of 500,000 people. This also positioned Final Fantasy XI as one of the most played MMOs during its early years, surpassing the likes of EverQuest Online. But the arrival of World of Warcraft changed the game, and in the years that followed, Final Fantasy XI struggled to adapt, with its player base starting to diminish after the release of the game's third expansion, Treasures of Artugan. Over time, those extreme design principles started to soften as a way of making the game more appealing to newcomers. And it's a testament to what the game achieved that even now, over 20 years since it launched, Final Fantasy XI is still online with a paid subscription model, as it's still being played by tens of thousands of people around the world. Final Fantasy XIII lands in our 31st position with a score of 3.2 out of 5, and with 82% of respondents saying they played the game, it's by far the most played games featured on this list so far. In the build-up to the release of Final Fantasy XIII, there was a huge amount of hype, and this was for numerous reasons. 1. It was the next game from the creative team behind Final Fantasy X. 2. It was the first part of a massive new mythology called Fabula Nova Crystallis. And 3. The first Final Fantasy games to usher in the past 3 console generations in Final Fantasy IV, 7 and 10 have been bona fide hits, and some of the best-selling and most critically praised games of all time. Final Fantasy XIII was to usher Final Fantasy into the next era, the HD era, and everyone, not just Final Fantasy fans, were desperate to see what they could accomplish. The trailer, which launched during E3 2006, set the stage for this, with jaw-dropping graphics and a dynamic-looking battle system that looked to evolve the ATB system much more than they had with Final Fantasy X-2. And such was the fervour around this time that many fan communities were formed, with 3 of the largest being FF-13.net, also known as FXN, Final Fantasy-13.net, and a website that I actually helped operate called FinalFantasy13.net. What fans weren't quite aware of at the time, however, was just how torrid a time the game was having in development, as Square's Product Development Division 1, as they were known at the time, were wrestling with internal politics relating to the persistent delays of Final Fantasy XII, and then the unexpected success and interest around the Final Fantasy VII technical demo for the PlayStation 3. Development originally started on Final Fantasy XIII at the beginning of 2004, after the dust had settled on Final Fantasy X-2. Motomo Toriyama, who had been a prominent part of the Final Fantasy X scenario team before being promoted to director on X-2, retained his role, and Kitase served as producer. The initial plan was to only spend around 18 months in development, which was slightly longer than 10 and 10-2, before releasing the game at the end of 2005 or the start of 2006, as the PlayStation 2 was starting to wind down. However, with Final Fantasy XII suffering from catastrophic delays, Final Fantasy XIII kept getting shelved, and the team were forced to keep themselves busy with other projects, like the Final Fantasy VII technical demo. Once it then became clear that the constant delays to Final Fantasy XII meant launching Final Fantasy XIII on the PlayStation 2 was no longer viable, based on how much interest had been garnered around seeing what Square Enix could do with HD graphics, the team decided to change the entire scope of the game, scrapping most of what they'd done to reboot it as a new project designed for the PlayStation 3. It was a bold move, and in the years that followed, the team desperately tried to create a project that matched their own internal goals. But numerous issues plagued production, and it took a long time for the scenario and battle systems to be nailed down, with neither solidified until quite far into development. The team also underestimated how much work was required to make an HD game, and numerous staff members ended up quitting Square Enix after development concluded due to how frustrated they had become throughout the game's development cycle. In spite of all these obstacles and issues though, Final Fantasy XIII did eventually release in Japan at the end of 2009, after almost 6 years in development. It received high praise for some aspects of its design, while facing criticism around others. Despite this, Final Fantasy XIII became the fastest-selling game in the history of the franchise, although the caveat here was that 13 had a very quick localization turnaround, while also being the first game to launch simultaneously in North America and Europe, and on 2 consoles. But it did end up as the best-selling game to launch on the PlayStation 3 in Japan, and it sold well over 4 million copies internationally. Final Fantasy XIII also spawned 2 sequels, one of which we've already covered, and one which is still yet to come. In 30th position is one of the more recent entries in the franchise, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, which received a score of 3.23 out of 5. Many years ago, when development on Dissidia Duodecim was wrapping up, Tetsuya Nomura conceptualized a project that revolved around the story of an angry man. But the project did not gain any real traction at the time and was left on the back burner. That was until Nomura was asked to provide concepts for some new games, so instead of coming up with something from scratch, he just reused the same concept and tweaked some aspects around. What they ended up with was a pseudo-Soulsborne game that was to also serve as a pseudo-sequel to the original Final Fantasy. And instead of playing as the Warriors of Light, you were to play as Jack Garland, who very much embodied the aforementioned angry man. Even though Nomura created the concept, its execution and delivery was then handed over to other people. Its story, for example, was conceived and written by Kazushige Nojima, and with Dissidia NT being shut down, Team Ninja were hired to deliver a suitable gameplay experience, no doubt due to what they'd produced with the wildly successful Nioh franchise. On paper, everything sounded great. Square Enix had been wanting to push more and more into the action RPG genre for years, and it sounded like they had a solid concept and a solid development partner to ensure that the concept was delivered. But almost as soon as the game was shown, any hype that came from the leaks that preceded was shattered. Within hours, Stranger of Paradise became a meme due to how frequently and passionately Jack said the word chaos, and the planned trial version demo that was announced at the conclusion of the trailer was corrupted upon launch. The demo itself, when it was fixed, was noted for its punishing difficulty and its complete lack of technical optimization. This then led to a second demo, which was par for the course for Team Ninja games, where they attempted to fix things and offer an expanded look at the overall gameplay experience. When the actual game then launched, a lot of the technical issues were fixed, but the game itself ended up splitting opinion. There were those who lauded its depth and writing, saying that they were both of the highest quality, while others felt as though the game was shallow and the writing unironically poor. Regardless of how people felt about these aspects, however, almost everyone agreed that for some reason, the game was incredibly satisfying and addictive. Then the DLC started to arrive, and opinions became even more split down the middle. It's unclear how well Square Enix expected Stranger of Paradise to perform commercially, but based on statements put out by the team, it underperformed. Nomura later noted that if a sequel was to exist, then a lot of work needed to be done within the community via word of mouth and increasing positive sentiment around the game. In 29th position, we have the game that started it all. Yes, the original Final Fantasy scored 3.24 out of 5. And one of the curious aspects here is that only 2/3 of the people who took the survey had ever even played the game, despite its importance to the franchise as a whole. Now at this point, most people are familiar with how Final Fantasy came to be. Hironobu Sakaguchi had become frustrated by the slew of games he'd overseen not performing in line with commercial expectations, and the reputation he'd gained at Square for being a bit of a taskmaster, something that earned him the nickname of Goblin. Throughout this time, Sakaguchi was still enrolled at university and was still paying tuition fees. He'd just chosen to defer his studies to pursue his dream. The path ahead was therefore clear. He'd undertake one last project, and if it didn't pan out, he'd quit Square and complete his education. The only caveat was that unlike the previous games, which were created to try and capitalize on wider trends seen within the industry, this time he'd create the game he always wanted to make, a role-playing game. The first challenge was that A, nobody really wanted to support this initiative internally, and B, those that did were tied up on their existing project, Highway Star. It meant Koichi Ishii, who joined Square as a fresh-faced young pup with very little experience working in the industry, was tasked with laying down a lot of the foundational work, alone. It was Ishii, for example, who ended up coming up with the 4 primary elements, their association with crystals, the side-on battle scenes, and the use of jobs. And when the rest of the team then joined up, many of these ideas were further developed and expanded upon within a relatively short period of time. As the project neared its conclusion, the rest of the company had done a near complete 180, with tons of additional staff called in to support after seeing how well the game was turning out, including the likes of Hiromichi Tanaka. At launch, Final Fantasy then far exceeded Square's projections. They had only wanted to order 200,000 copies of the game, having been underwhelmed by the performance of Sakaguchi's previous titles. He, though, fought for 500,000 copies to be produced, and they compromised at 400,000. After launch, Square sold through those 400,000 copies very quickly, and even ordered a second run to keep up with demand. This generated huge amounts of revenue and altered the entire trajectory of the company, and its impact in North America was even more pronounced, with even more copies sold as it wowed audiences across the continent. Time, however, has not been a kind mistress to Final Fantasy. When compared to the games that followed throughout the 8-bit and 16-bit era, which were more advanced in almost every way, it doesn't stack up as well. But there is a high degree of nostalgia associated with the game. These sentiments then came through when asking people to describe the game in just 5 words. The general vibe was that the game was simple, basic, and fun, but the most prominent word used was classic. On the negative side though, some people felt the game was now very outdated and boring as a result. After exploring where the franchise began, we next go to where the franchise took its first steps in a new direction. Yes, in 28th position, we have the first Final Fantasy video game sequel, Final Fantasy X-2, with a score of 3.28 out of 5. When Yoichi Wada inherited the top position at Square, he was given a single objective: steady the ship that many believed was going to sink due to their continued financial woes. Wada explored numerous options for how he could alter the trajectory of the company, but one of the more lucrative concepts revolved around what he called polymorphic content. Prior to the rise of WADA, Sakaguchi was always adamant that Final Fantasy games should never have sequels, at least in video game form. He wanted effort and resources spent on creating new and innovative projects. But with Sakaguchi gone, WADA instructed Yoshinori Kitase and Tetsuya Nomura to start figuring out how they could exploit existing franchises in a cost-effective manner. And this led to them taking a closer look at Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X, the 2 most successful games ever produced by the company. Plans were drawn up for the expansion of each game's universe, but because it was the most recent, Final Fantasy X was to be the guinea pig, as they could create a direct sequel that implemented cost-effective development methodologies such as reusing existing assets in order to reduce costs and increase their profit margin. The only challenge was that Final Fantasy X had been designed as a self-contained story with a pretty clear conclusion. There was also a lot of uncertainty around WADA's new initiative, so the team decided to test the waters by creating a short movie called Eternal Calm that was packaged in with Final Fantasy X International. When it launched though, WADA's assertion proved to be true. Fans of the original game were desperate for more due to how much they'd grown to love the characters and Spira as a whole. With the test successful, Kitase stepped into the new role of producer, and Motomo Toriyama, who served as an event director on the original game, stepped into the director's chair. He put forth a bold new vision for what became known as X-2. This meant that instead of being more of the same, Toriyama proposed making a game that would serve as a contrast to the original. This saw Yuna transformed from the timid summoner to a gun-wielding assertive young woman, and she was joined by 2 other characters, Riku and Pain. Gameplay also evolved from the conditional turn-based battle system to a fast-paced ATB system, and even the soundtrack had a very different vibe, as stalwart composer Nobuo Uematsu didn't contribute a single track. Many of these changes ended up dividing parts of the fanbase, but in spite of the varied response, X-2 ended up being a very lucrative venture for Square. Despite costing significantly less to produce than Final Fantasy X, X-2 reviewed relatively well and sold over 5 million copies. This showed that WADA's approach had real financial merits, and it had a huge impact on how Square Enix began to operate as a company. Next, in position 27, we have our highest ranking mobile game on the list, and that's Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia with a score of 3.32 out of 5. Now, it's become clear that many of the lowest scoring entries on this list were mobile games, but Dissidia Opera Omnia was built differently, and this approach resonated with audiences around the world for that specific reason. With Square Enix working with Team Ninja to produce an iteration of Dissidia for arcades, they also sought to create a complementary experience for mobile devices. But unlike every prior release in the Dissidia franchise, Opera Omnia deviated in a considerable manner by moving away from the fighting genre. Instead, it was to be developed as a traditional turn-based role-playing game that featured the various mechanics that had been established since the original game, such as bravery and breaks. When Opera Omnia was then revealed to the public, it also became clear that even though there would be similarities with the regular fighting game series, there would also be key differences beyond this. And perhaps one of the most important was the array of characters available for players to choose from. Previous Dissidia entries had a primary focus around protagonists and antagonists from the mainline games, with Dissidia Duodecim only introducing a handful of supplemental characters. But when the debut trailer for Opera Omnia dropped, it showed Vivi, Sars, Penelo Rem, and even Seymour. They wanted the game to be representative of the franchise as a whole, instead of just focusing on the poster children. The other main aspect related to design. Early on, the developers took the decision to relax their approach to monetization. Games like Record Keeper, Mobius, and Brave Exvius were notorious for how aggressive they were, both through gacha mechanics and even restricting how much people could even play the game without paying more money. Their primary purpose was to encourage people to spend. And while Opera Omnia did still retain gacha mechanics when it came to weapon and character acquisition, no restrictions were placed around how much people could play the game. They were free to play as many events or story missions as they wanted without having to wait a certain amount of time or pay money to unlock the privilege to play the game more. In the early days, at least, this then made the game feel much more accessible and less pay to win, and this, combined with the fun and novel interpretations of the characters that featured, helped to separate Opera Omnia from the other games in Square Enix's mobile roster. Unfortunately, the game was shut down in February of 2024, with the developers claiming they'd just taken things as far as they could. Still, if you'd like to enjoy the nearly 100 hours of cutscenes created throughout the game's lifespan, you're able to do so thanks to a YouTuber called Gameplay Sharks. In 26th position, we have the second major sequel to be created in relation to the Final Fantasy franchise, as Final Fantasy XIII-2 scored 3.35 out of 5. Even though Final Fantasy XIII was part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis sub-franchise, and many other properties were announced as part of this, Final Fantasy XIII itself was planned to be self-contained. There was no grand scheme of expanding the story upon its conclusion. But after the game shipped, the development team felt it had performed well enough to warrant returning for a sequel that could be produced on a much lower budget and much quicker due to a combination of reusing assets and incorporating many of the elements that were forced to be cut from the first game due to a combination of time constraints or technological limitations. Development on the follow-up started a month after the release of Final Fantasy XIII in North America and Europe, and in the initial sense, Motomo Toriyama did not want to create a direct sequel. His initial plan was to instead create a game that took place 900 years in the future, with the tentative title Final Fantasy XIII Season 2. Some aspects of this initial plan were retained, but it evolved into a direct sequel that revolved around time travel instead, and this then allowed them to address the primary pieces of criticism levied at the original game, linearity. Toriyama also wanted to shine the light on a character who was meant to be a protagonist from the original game but had her role diminished, Serah, and their Mog was created to support on the journey. But to ensure Final Fantasy XIII-2 did not go down the same path as Final Fantasy X-2, Kitase mandated that there needed to be balance, and this led to the inclusion of Null. They also made the decision to abandon a lot of the concepts associated with the Fabula Nova Crystallis franchise, as they felt they were a deterrent to enjoyment due to how confused players had become. And whereas Final Fantasy XIII spent almost 6 years in development, Final Fantasy XIII-2 was created in only 2 years, with a much leaner team as well. Toriyama had found directing 13 difficult due to the sheer size of the team, as it was hard to communicate his vision. In addition to reducing the size of the internal team, they also increased outsourcing to reduce points of communication, and this saw them collaborate with TriAce. Much of what the team did was positive. Famitsu even awarded the game a perfect score, but sales did not match its predecessor, and Final Fantasy XIII-2 sold 65% fewer copies during its first week on sale in Japan. Western reviewers also weren't as impressed, scoring the game lower than Final Fantasy XIII, and there was widespread criticism of the game's ending as well as its post-launch content. But within the fanbase, people were a lot more receptive to the changes that were made, as they felt it addressed many of the points of concern from Final Fantasy XIII itself. Introducing our top 25, we have the first remake on the list, as the Final Fantasy III remake for the Nintendo DS scored 3.37 out of 5, and that was a full 0.28 ahead of the 2D version. The tale of this game is one of considerable woe before a joyous conclusion, as for countless years, Square and then Square Enix attempted to re-release Final Fantasy III on new hardware with limited success. There was an appreciation that 1. Final Fantasy III was their best-selling game from the 8-bit era, and 2. It was never released outside of Japan, and both of those factors played into their decision to first try and port the game to the WonderSwan Color and then the Game Boy Advance. The challenge was that Final Fantasy III was a mammoth game that took full advantage of the Famicom cartridge. Replicating that on the WonderSwan Color and then the Game Boy Advance, but with higher fidelity assets, proved to be a stumbling block. With neither version going anywhere, considerations were put towards a straight port for the PlayStation 2 before they eventually settled on the Nintendo DS. This then saw the project completely transformed from being a 16-bit remake, as they'd done with Final Fantasy I and II, to a full-on 3D remake that could take full advantage of Nintendo's next-generation handheld system. With the platform decided, Matrix Software, who were known to Square Enix having worked on an enhanced remake of Dragon Quest V for the PlayStation 2, were hired to conduct the bulk of development. Hiromichi Tanaka, who had served as the chief game designer of the original game, then returned to oversee the project as both director and executive producer. And Tomoya Asano, a fresher face at the company who had joined Enix a few years prior, was appointed as producer. They attempted to make sure the game was faithful to the original, but also adaptive. As a consequence, even though the majority of the elements were retained, narrative changes were also made, such as giving names to the 4 protagonists, and the job system was redesigned and rebalanced. New functionality was also added to take advantage of the Nintendo DS's unique hardware capabilities. Due to a combination of development costs and how much time had passed since the release of the original, there was a belief within Square Enix that the Final Fantasy III remake wouldn't sell all that well. Indeed, internal sales estimates placed it at only achieving 350,000 copies in Japan over its lifetime, but it sold over 500,000 during its first week. And as the game had never been released before outside of Japan, it also performed incredibly well in North America and Europe, with many appreciating the quality of life adjustments that had been made. In 24th position, we have World of Final Fantasy, with a score of 3.42 out of 5. This gem of a game had the unfortunate, or fortunate fate of releasing right before Final Fantasy XV due to the latter game's delay, and it's never been possible to tell how much it affected its fate. However, only around a third of the people who took the survey stated that they'd ever even played it. What's also somewhat ironic, however, is that World of Final Fantasy started off as a mobile game. Shinji Hashimoto and Hiroki Chiba felt that Final Fantasy had become thematically too adult, and there was nothing that really catered to the younger audiences that Final Fantasy games were originally targeted to. They therefore envisioned a new type of experience that had the potential to appeal to younger audiences, while also drawing in older fans too. And they would do this by featuring cool characters, adorable visuals, and monster collection, while also leveraging the pull of the franchise's many legendary characters and monsters. Something that Chiba was passionate about due to his involvement in working on the stories of characters throughout the so-called Golden Era. One of the most eye-catching elements, though, was the dual art style. This meant some characters appeared with a chibi design, while others had normalized proportions. This also led to the game featuring animated sequences, as well as FMV sequences, and the blend created a compelling visual style that was then adapted into an evolved version of the classic battle system. The idea was to build on the ATB system that had been so successful for so long, and they did this by integrating it with the aforementioned monster collection mechanic. The system was inspired by Dragon Quest monsters, and it allowed characters to use captured monsters in combat in novel and unique ways via the stacking system. By combining all of these elements, World of Final Fantasy was perceived by many to be the best of both worlds. On the surface, it felt like a game for kids, but those who invested time were surprised by how much depth there was with both the combat mechanics and the game's story. There were still aspects that could have been improved, however, but World of Final Fantasy accomplished its goal and ended up selling over 1 million copies worldwide before receiving a significant expansion via the Maxima upgrade. Now, based on what we just discussed, it feels fitting that Final Fantasy XV appears in 23rd position, just after the game that it ended up launching just after. It was given an average score of 3.5 out of 5 by respondents of the survey. The tale of Final Fantasy XV, even down to that delay after having such a prominent and public release date announcement, is a very interesting one to tell. But it's not just the tale of one game, it's the tale of two games. Final Fantasy Versus 13 and Final Fantasy 15. One game could not exist without the other, their fates were intrinsically linked. The original vision for what ended up becoming Final Fantasy 15 was announced as Versus 13 all the way back in 2006, 10 years before the game was eventually shipped. The trailer was a complete tonal shift from Final Fantasy 13, meant to emphasize the clear alignment with Versus 13 being associated with the dark and 13 towards the light. It was here that we were introduced to an edgy-looking main protagonist called Noctis, and the trailer even featured blood, something that was almost never seen in modern depictions of Final Fantasy. In the years that followed, we also got to learn more about his close friends, Gladio, Ignis and Prompto, and other characters such as Stella, Nox Fleuret. By 2012, with 6 years of minimal progress that was blamed on issues with technology and poor internal resource management, Square Enix faced a crucial decision: to cancel Versus 13 or reboot the project as a brand new game. Yuichi Wada was leaning towards cancellation, but Hajime Tabata convinced him that the project was salvageable. The following year, Versus 13 was rebranded as Final Fantasy 15, and Tabata ended up replacing Tetsuya Nomura as the game's director. From that point on, Tabata emphasized community and transparency, and this led to plenty of positive moments, but also some awkward ones too. Much of this was delivered via the active time report concept, but Tabata also wanted to show his face as much as possible, visiting trade shows and satellite Square Enix offices all over the world to meet as many fans as possible face to face. Tabata later shared that when he took over the project, executives at Square Enix believed that Final Fantasy was in such a bad place following the demise of the Fabula Nova Crystallis franchise and the original vision of 14 that 15 would struggle to sell 5 million copies. He challenged this and set 5 million as the minimum acceptable total. Upon launch, that total was achieved day one. But even though praise was given for the game's visual and sound design, as well as the engaging combat, it was not without its criticisms. The story received mixed reviews, and other elements of the game were perceived as being rushed and unfinished. In response, the team worked tirelessly to turn Final Fantasy XV into a pseudo-live service game, producing regular events and collaborations, as well as releasing free updates that ended up making substantial changes to the base game. This was then complemented by paid-for downloadable content that helped to flesh the game out and fill in those glaring gaps in the story. By the end, the team's continued efforts ended up leaving a lasting impression, and Final Fantasy XV now stands as one of the best-selling games in the history of the franchise, but also Square Enix as a company. However, as shown by its position on the list, it's still a very divisive game. When asking people for their overriding sentiments, some of the concepts came true. People spoke of friendship, the road trip, and brotherhood, but they were counterbalanced by words like unfinished, incomplete, and unfulfilled potential. In 22nd position, we have a game that fans of the franchise have been looking forward to before it was even announced. Yes, we're referring to the original Dissidia Final Fantasy, which scored 3.51 out of 5. For years, fans had wondered how the series' various protagonists and antagonists might stack up against each other in a fight. But outside of some brief teasers in games like Ehrgeiz, no such experience ever seemed to be forthcoming. That was until a failed idea led to something else being born. When working on Kingdom Hearts 2, Tetsuya Nomura started to explore the creation of a fighting game where Disney and Kingdom Hearts characters could square off against each other in a 3D arena. This idea didn't get too far, however, as someone pointed out that Disney were unlikely to approve a game where their characters were fighting. But to ensure their efforts weren't wasted, they explored how the concept might work when aligned with the Final Fantasy franchise. Development on Dissidia started as Kingdom Hearts 2 was wrapping up, with Takeshi Arakawa, who was a senior figure in the Kingdom Hearts team, installed as director. And true to that original vision, they sought to create a game where Final Fantasy characters fought against each other in a 3D arena that was not confined by tradition. Leaning on the fantasy, fights would feature a high degree of mobility, with huge action sequences taking place off the ground, and an innovative system adding depth as characters would not just have a health bar, but also a brave bar. They ended up spending over 2 years developing and refining the battle system, with a further year spent on creating the story and wider role-playing mechanics. Much time was also spent on figuring out the cast of characters, something that was especially complicated for games such as Final Fantasy VI and X, where the main protagonists and antagonists were less clear-cut. Due to how much time was spent on development, Dissidia ended up being a very late addition to the series' 20th anniversary celebrations. But due to its content, how well everything was developed, and how much effort was placed on ensuring it catered to every major market around the world, it was a very welcome addition. Dissidia posted strong reviews and very strong sales, and this empowered the developers to explore its future potential with a lot of gusto. 21st position is occupied by a property from what became known as the Ivalice Alliance, as Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift received a score of 3.56 out of 5. Due to the success of Final Fantasy Tactics, a sequel was given the green light before Final Fantasy XII had even released. The original plan was to have this serve as a quick follow-up on the Game Boy Advance, using many of the same assets and engine as a way of drawing back the original player base. However, Square Enix were wooed by Nintendo into abandoning the Game Boy Advance in favour of their new handheld, the DS, and once the decision was taken, work was quickly moved over. As they were keen to make use of the new hardware, this saw Tactics A2 feature graphics that were far more impressive, and in general, the entire scope of the game was much larger, with tons more jobs and around 400 quests baked into the experience, each of which was made unique to avoid typical side quest monotony. Unfortunately, despite their grand ambitions, even though these changes were appreciated, the core experience didn't feel as strong as the original game. And this then saw Tactics A2 struggle to match the performance of its predecessor in every major region, something that then started to signal the demise of the Ivalice brand. These sentiments were then highlighted within the survey itself, as in 20th position we find Tactics Advance, which scored 5.57 out of 5, just 0.1 higher than Tactics A2. This game though has a slightly different story. After working on creating Final Fantasy Tactics, even though there were plans for a direct sequel, Yasumi Matsuno had already moved on to working on Vagrant's story, before then being asked to helm Final Fantasy XII. However, as part of the deal that saw Square become cozy with Nintendo again, Square had to commit to creating an original game for the Game Boy Advance. To fulfill this objective, they started working on a remix of the successful Final Fantasy Tactics, as they knew it had a higher chance of succeeding than creating a new spin-off from scratch. And to ensure it did succeed, they not only installed Matsuno as producer, a role he had to fulfill alongside directing Final Fantasy XII, but they also bought Quest, his old company, who had continued to work on the Ogre franchise following his departure. Matsuno then ended up working alongside the director of Tactics Ogre, The Knight of Lodis, a follow-up to Tactics Advance that had already been released on the Game Boy Advance. But even though the two creators had worked on the same franchise, just at different times and in the same genre, they had very differing views on how Tactics Advance should be developed. This led to numerous debates and compromises having to be made, something that was no doubt made even more complicated by the struggles Final Fantasy XII was enduring around the same time. Regardless, the creative team working on Tactics Advance resolved their differences and came up with a strong premise that did not impede on the original. It also took a much softer tone, something that they hoped would make it more appealing to a younger audience. These decisions proved to be quite shrewd. Despite Tactics Advance releasing well before Final Fantasy XII, its impact was not insignificant. Its sales did not match those of the original Tactics, but it was still a strong performing title for Square, with over 1.4 million copies sold globally. And in an unusual turn of events, a large portion of those gamers came from overseas, as opposed to being isolated in Japan. As we venture inside the top 20, Theatre of Them Final Fantasy placed in 19th position with a score of 3.68 out of 5. Similar to the Dissidia franchise, Theatre of Them was a concept that went through a few revisions before manifesting, and it also came from an unlikely source. The story goes that Ichiro Hazama, who had joined Square in 1998 and had worked in the merchandising department for many years, felt that the company was missing out by not having a game that leveraged its amazing library of music. For many years, he had wanted to make that game, but due to his position within the company, it felt out of reach. That was until Hazama was given a slightly different role on Advent Children, and he was able to use this new role to broach the conversation. Hazama made his pitch, which was for the production of a Final Fantasy rhythm game on the Nintendo DS, and it was tentatively approved. However, after undergoing initial investigations, even though the touch functionality was the perfect fit, the Nintendo DS lacked the storage capacity to make the concept work. It was therefore shelved until the Nintendo 3DS. With the project reapproved, Hazama worked with a developer called Indie Zero, where one of his good friends, Masanobu Suzui, just happened to be a key figure. Hazama did much of the prep work while serving as a project manager on Dissidia, with song selection proving to be one of the hardest aspects. They eventually ended up with a strong selection of songs associated with the mainline Final Fantasy games. But to ensure it was focused, as had been the case with the original Dissidia, this meant they chose not to include music from any of the spin-offs. The only exception was Somnus from Versus 13, which they justified due to its connection with 13 and Fabula Nova Crystallis. Nomura also felt that, due to Theatre of Them being a tribute game, it would be interesting to create a loose association with Dissidia. He therefore suggested that both Chaos and Cosmos, two central lore figures from the Dissidia universe, featured in the game's logo. But instead of using similar assets to Dissidia, they instead chose to work with Monster Octopus, who had created avatars for Kingdom Hearts Mobile and Kingdom Hearts Recoded. These avatars were also used for Final Fantasy Brigade, which had launched in the previous month to try and cut down costs on asset creation. When Theatre of Them launched on the Nintendo 3DS, the response was very positive. Even though the gameplay and modes offered were by no means revolutionary, they didn't need to be due to the subject matter. Fans just appreciated what the game was, a wonderful memento that allowed them to enjoy fantastic pieces of music outside of the typical setting. But the same reverence was not afforded for the iOS port. Due to how much content was cut from the base experience, it led to significant criticism around the exorbitant cost of obtaining all the songs that were included in the 3DS version by default. This then sullied the reputation of the game somewhat, but not enough to dampen the overall perception of the experience as shown by its placement on this list. In 18th position, we have Final Fantasy XII with a score of 3.74 out of 5. Final Fantasy XII was positioned as the final part of a brand new initiative and direction for the Final Fantasy franchise that was proposed by Sakaguchi as the 6th generation of consoles loomed. Up until this point, the franchise had seen linear development, and its growth had been slow and steady. There were still those who felt Final Fantasy VII was too much of a shift away from its 8-bit and 16-bit predecessors, but the evolution was still easy to see for those who had been long-time fans. Due to how successful Final Fantasy VII was, however, the franchise also had a huge influx of new fans, and many of them were unfamiliar with the previous games. This happened in Japan, but was far more pronounced internationally. And this made a big difference. Up until that point, Final Fantasy had been a very Japan-centric franchise, with around 90% of its total sales coming from that region. The remaining percentages came from North America through sporadic releases, and Europe had almost zero exposure. But Final Fantasy VII ended up selling more copies across North America and Europe than Japan, and this, combined with its evolution, created a huge split in the fanbase. Final Fantasy VIII continued to cater more towards these so-called new fans, but Sakaguchi did not want to just abandon the so-called old fans, and this then led to a new strategy of creating mainline Final Fantasy games for different fan groups. Final Fantasy IX, 10, 11, and 12 were all announced in quick succession, and they were all developed by different teams with different target demographics. Final Fantasy IX and 10 were there to target the old and new fans respectively, with Final Fantasy XI established to try and draw in another set of new fans, those who liked MMORPGs. Final Fantasy XII was then to serve as a continuation of another experiment that proved Sakaguchi's theory. During the same year that Final Fantasy VII launched, so too did the first major spin-off, called Final Fantasy Tactics. It was the brainchild of Yasumi Matsuno and Hiroyuki Ito, and it showed that Final Fantasy could be blended with tactical role-playing and a mature and gritty story. The same team were then placed in charge of Final Fantasy XII, and the initial plan was to try and leverage their shared experiences to create an innovative game that would fuse together the elements that made games like Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy Tactics so successful. But not everything went to plan. Due to a less than ideal team setup, as the development team was created by merging a few different groups together, much of the early planning time was spent on mediation and resolving creative differences. This then led to the game missing deadline after deadline, and there was no hope of it shipping during its intended release window of 2003. The other major problem came from Sakaguchi's role. Sakaguchi had always been a huge fan of Matsuno, and was there to protect his creative vision even when things weren't panning out. But with Sakaguchi gone, as part of the fallout of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, Matsuno lost his creative shield. He then struggled to balance the demands of the executives and the demands of his team, which was now hundreds of people and contained plenty of strong personalities. By 2005, the game had missed its target release window by 2 years, and to make matters worse, Matsuno decided to step down from his leadership position due to ill health. This led to Ito and Hiroshi Minagawa stepping up to share directorial duties, with Akitoshi Kawazu coming on board as executive producer to replace Sakaguchi. In spite of all these major setbacks though, the team persevered, and when Final Fantasy XII released in 2006, it was clear that the final product had ended up fulfilling Sakaguchi's initial objective. The story was much more serious and political, the gameplay was more mature and tactical, featuring free-roaming combat and a sophisticated evolution of the ATB system called Active Dimension Battle. And the presentation on almost all fronts was radically different from every previous mainline entry. But Final Fantasy XII still retained the essence of the franchise, and upon its release, it ended up becoming the first game in the history of the franchise to receive a perfect score from Famitsu. Western critics and fans were also overjoyed by the more open-world feel, as Final Fantasy XII felt less linear than previous games. But it was also a big departure from what some of the newer generation of fans were expecting from a Final Fantasy game, and this led to some discourse within the community. Amongst the various descriptions people gave in this survey, the topics that came up were mostly about the story and the gambit system, both in a positive and negative light. There were those who felt the story was great due to its political intrigue, but also felt it was bland, boring, and slow-paced. In 17th position, we find Dissidia Duodecim, with a score of 3.75 out of 5. Which ended up selling almost 1 million copies in Japan alone. Square Enix greenlit a sequel almost immediately. They realised how much potential this new sub-franchise had, and wanted to take advantage by creating an even bigger and better game that used the same concept. The main objective was therefore to simply increase the character roster. Based on who had not made the cut for the first game, numerous staff members had characters they wanted to include, and it made the selection process much more difficult, as the criteria was now no longer as strict. To help come to a logical consensus, numerous aspects were considered, such as a character's relative popularity around the world and how unique their inclusion would make the gameplay. But as they were still subjective metrics, many characters were presented. In the end, 9 were chosen, many of which were added to the side of Cosmos, and to accommodate for their inclusion and to develop the story, protagonists such as Cloud and Tidus had their allegiance shifted to Chaos. In addition to the expanded roster, the development team strove to make sure the gameplay suitably improved, and it led to the introduction of the Assist feature, which was designed to counterbalance the power of the EX mode. The story concept also saw significant expansion. It saw Dissidia Duodecim serve as a prequel to the original game, adding layers of depth to a storyline that also connected with the original Final Fantasy. But it also served as a remake, as the original story was included in the game too. This made the package hugely compelling, as it improved on almost every aspect. This was then reflected in critical praise and indeed its position within this list in comparison to the original game. But despite how positive everything was, Dissidia Duodecim struggled to get anywhere near the same sales figures as the original. And that was even reflected within this survey too, as almost less than a third of the respondents said they played Dissidia Duodecim in comparison to the original Dissidia. 16th on our list we have Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, with a score of 3.82 out of 5. Its high placement may come as a surprise to some people, but Crisis Core was able to resonate with fans, especially younger ones, due to purposeful and smart decisions made throughout its development in relation to the story, and those feelings ended up being very powerful. But things could have been very different. Crisis Core did not start out as an independent game. Instead, the plan was to create an enhanced port of Before Crisis for the PlayStation Portable, called Before Crisis Core, with the core meant to denote that it was the Core Edition. This sentiment came from Tetsuya Nomura, who always wanted to come up with an alternative way of saying enhanced, something that was shown by Kingdom Hearts through Final Mix. As he had overseen the original game, Hajime Tabata was assigned to work on the enhanced port, but before development got too far, Tabata and Nomura decided it would be more fun to make a new game instead, and that this game should focus on Zack Fair. Even though Zack had been a minor character in Final Fantasy VII, his impact was quite profound. And he had also impacted the staff too, with Nomura and Kazushige Nojima having created a lot of supporting material for Zack, even though it never manifested in-game. What then became known as Crisis Core gave them the opportunity to use this material. The platform also worked, as Tabata and his team were able to work to the strengths of the PlayStation Portable, providing just enough story to counterbalance the short, sharp missions. Everything then culminated with a dramatic conclusion, which was as devastating for those who had played Final Fantasy VII as it was for those who were coming in fresh. And this was due to how well Zack had been fleshed out as a character throughout the entire game. After a few delays, Crisis Core ended up being released during Final Fantasy VII's 10th anniversary. In Japan, it became the second fastest selling game to be released on the PlayStation Portable, and its success overseas helped the game to sell over 2 million copies. There was also a direct link between the release of Crisis Core and a huge rise in popularity for Zack Fair, and this then had a major impact on the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, and even encouraged the production of a deluxe remaster called Crisis Core Reunion. In 15th position, we have Final Fantasy V, a game that Sakaguchi stated was his favourite in the franchise up until the release of Final Fantasy IX. Here, it scored 3.85 out of 5 amongst survey respondents. Final Fantasy V arrived at an interesting time for the franchise, as after successfully transitioning Final Fantasy into the 16-bit era, the team had high expectations for how much quality could be extracted from the Super Famicom. With the core development spine established, Sakaguchi was able to blend the experience of franchise veterans such as Kazuko Shibuya, Hiroyuki Ito, and Ken Narita with supplemental skills from individuals who joined from departments such as Yoshinori Kitase. Plenty of new hires then joined the production too, such as Tetsuya Nomura and Hiroshi Tokai, lending their own youthful vigour. The main objective this time around, though, was to make sure that everything about the game felt much simpler, when in fact it was to be made more advanced. The sentiment applied to the story and mechanics, but how it manifested differed. For example, even though the cast of characters shrunk significantly compared to Final Fantasy IV, making the story seem much more simple on the surface, the characters that remained had much more intricate narrative arcs. Meaningful side quests were also added, and the story was made less linear. From a gameplay perspective, jobs returned, and there were plenty of them. But the game was designed so that players could complete the game with any combination of jobs, and this included just sticking with the original ones given to the player at the beginning of the game. If players wanted to explore though, then the job system was designed to be much deeper and more complex than what was seen in Final Fantasy III. Over 20 jobs featured, and thanks to the mastery system, they could even be combined to create hybrid jobs. By the end of development, Final Fantasy V had become a very comprehensive experience, and when it was released, the Japanese public couldn't get enough. Final Fantasy V managed to sell almost 2.5 million copies, a significant increase on both Final Fantasy III and IV, and it also scored well with critics. Unfortunately though, due to the mini identity crisis Final Fantasy was suffering in North America, even though there were plans to localize it for the Super Nintendo, first as Final Fantasy III and then as Final Fantasy Extreme, they didn't ever materialize, and it was some time until Western audiences were first exposed to the game. But the objectives of the game came through with the sentiments people gave in the survey. They spoke about how the game was customizable, innovative, and fun. But others felt that to maximize the mechanics, the game also felt too grindy. As we continue to move further up the list, we now have Theatrhythm Final Fantasy Curtain Call in 14th position with a score of 3.87 out of 5. The original Theatrhythm ended up as a successful experiment, but almost as soon as it had shipped, the team started to explore the creation of a follow-up game that would have considerably more depth. The approach they followed was similar to that seen with Dissidia Duodecim. This meant loosening the shackles a bit on what content could feature in the game, and this opened the door to including characters and music from sequels and spin-offs. What became known as Curtain Call was also created with the objective of ensuring that no stone was left unturned. This was to be the definitive experience, and provisions were taken to even allow more tracks to be added via DLC. Alongside the additional content, Curtain Call also added new modes such as Versus and Quest Medley, and with the game featuring well over 200 tracks, it was a far superior product to the original game. This was then reflected by Curtain Call's position on this list relative to Theatrhythm, but it also highlighted something else. Even though Curtain Call was a better game, its sales were not as strong, and that was shown here, as far fewer people said they played Curtain Call in relation to the original game. In 13th position, we have our first game from the so-called Golden Era, as Final Fantasy VIII scored 3.94 out of 5. Ever since the first Final Fantasy game was released in 1987, the franchise had known nothing but growth. Sometimes that growth was smaller than others, but even in those instances it was down to other circumstances. For example, when Final Fantasy VI only managed to outsell Final Fantasy V by 100,000 copies, it was because the price point of the cartridge itself was around 20 to 30% higher. Final Fantasy VII put the franchise on an entirely new trajectory. But the objective with Final Fantasy VIII remained the same as it always had been: make a game that was bigger and better than the last one. There was one big shift, however. This time, due to increasing commitments elsewhere, Sakaguchi took more of a back seat throughout development, delegating the duties of producer to Shinji Hashimoto. He was still involved, however, and it was Sakaguchi who pushed the team to use high-quality FMV sequences that would even be integrated into playable segments. But everything else was a light touch, and this meant that, for the first time, Sakaguchi had limited involvement with the story of a Final Fantasy game. Instead, the team of Kitase, Nomura, Chiba, and Nojima used their experiences to create a very different kind of Final Fantasy experience that was based around a school setting. Together, this team also expanded a concept Kitase and Nomura had been thinking about since they worked together on Final Fantasy V, the concept of using two parties across time who complemented each other. One party ended up being led by Squall and the other led by Laguna. And to convey the differences in age and experience, they used this approach to help players gain more context around what had happened historically in the lead up to the events of the present day. Hiroyuki Ito also returned to oversee an evolution of the ATB system that incorporated more active participation from the player, and he also came up with a new, flexible character progression system called junctioning. Another area where Final Fantasy VIII excelled, though, was localization. Its predecessor had exceeded expectations overseas, but localization on Final Fantasy VII had been a significant afterthought. It still wasn't perfect with Final Fantasy VIII, as communication remained limited between the various teams, but Richard Honeywood and Alexander O. Smith were allowed more time and creative freedom to create a localized script that felt more consistent between the two languages. By combining everything together, Square were then able to produce an exceptional game that smashed sales records around the world, surpassing Final Fantasy VII to become the fastest-selling game in the history of Japanese and North American video gaming. But even though those initial accolades were very impressive, Final Fantasy VIII did not prove as enduring as Final Fantasy VII. And along with posting lower lifetime sales on the PlayStation, it also enjoyed much less long-term interest in its cast and characters and wider world. Over time, this has bred negative sentiment, something that was highlighted in how people described the game in this survey. People felt the game was confusing, flawed, and convoluted, with junctioning coming up a lot in relation to those words. But there were those who felt the game had been given a bad rap, saying it was underrated and had a beautiful and interesting story. With a score of 3.95 out of 5, which was only 0.01 higher than Final Fantasy VIII, we then have the 2D version of Final Fantasy IV in 12th position. Final Fantasy IV ended up having a rather tumultuous development cycle due to some decisions that were made very early on. The idea of console generations was still quite new, and even though adoption of the Super Famicom was quite quick, the Famicom still had a pretty significant market share of its own. Square were therefore keen to try and take advantage of both hardware solutions, so they drafted up plans for the production of two brand new Final Fantasy games, one for the Famicom and one for the Super Famicom. They were planned to be developed concurrently, and they were also scheduled to release in 1991. However, Final Fantasy V, which was being developed for the Super Famicom, was to release first, as Square wanted to dazzle expectant audiences. But when they announced this to customers and also went through their internal playtests, something felt wrong. They were going to be asking people to play a super modern and advanced Final Fantasy game, then ask those same people to play another Final Fantasy game that no matter what they did was always going to feel inferior. This led to Square making a painful decision, and they cancelled Final Fantasy IV for the Famicom even though it was around 80% complete, before then renaming Final Fantasy V to Final Fantasy IV. Good ideas from the Famicom game were then consolidated into the Super Famicom release, and it became a best of both worlds situation. But it was incredibly stressful for the team, and it increased pressure on Final Fantasy IV to succeed. There was still a high degree of confidence though, as even though Final Fantasy IV was being developed by the so-called new generation of developers, with the likes of Hiroyuki Ito and Takashi Tokita promoted into senior positions, what they were doing was also very innovative. The story, overseen by Tokita, was now much more dense, with a huge cast of characters, and the battle system, overseen by Ito, was much more advanced and interactive thanks to the active time battle concept. Many of these changes helped to elevate Final Fantasy to the next level in Japan, and with no Dragon Quest game releasing to challenge it on the Super Famicom, it also helped to cement Final Fantasy's position as a worthy competitor and premium role-playing game for the next generation of console gamers. Final Fantasy IV also received localization, whereas Final Fantasy V did not, and it's perhaps for this reason that it appears higher on the list. But regardless, those who gave their thoughts for this survey felt the story was compelling thanks to its tale of redemption, with Kain and Cecil serving as the very embodiments of the Paladin and Dragoon. Following Final Fantasy IV, we then have the Final Fantasy IV Remake, which was voted marginally higher with a score of 3.96 out of 5. This might seem like a no-brainer, but lest we forget that the Final Fantasy III Remake ranked almost 10 places higher than its 2D cousin. Part of this was because of how much the development team had learned on that previous game, as after working on the Final Fantasy III Remake, Asano and his team moved straight on to working on a remake of Final Fantasy IV, even though Final Fantasy IV Advance had only just been released. One of the major differences between the two projects, though, came from the enhancements that were made. The Final Fantasy III Remake did see some tweaks made to the story and gameplay, but this notion was taken much further with Final Fantasy IV. It saw Tokita, who had written the original script, attempt to reintegrate the segments of the story that ended up being cut or truncated from the original Super Famicom release. This saw them focus much more on the backstory of Cecil and Kane, while also showing more about the whole Golbez succumbed to Zemus. Hiroyuki Ito also returns to modernise the ATB system. A whole host of quality of life changes were introduced too alongside this, but they also created the augment system, which allowed characters to learn special abilities that were not innate. These changes were then complemented by more system-specific functions that came via brand new minigames and a new eidolon called Wit. With all of these new elements in place, the Final Fantasy IV Remake ended up being a faithful and expansive take on the 16-bit classic. Praise was offered for how the narrative had evolved, and there was a general feeling that through more modern advances, such as the inclusion of voice acting, its overall impact was elevated. That was then reflected with sales, as the Final Fantasy IV Remake performed much better than Final Fantasy IV Advance, and managed to sell over 1 million copies worldwide. In 10th position, we have one of the most recent mainline entries, which also ended up being quite divisive within the existing community, but also the wider gaming sphere due to how it was represented. Yes, we're talking about Final Fantasy XVI, which those who took the survey scored as a 3.99 out of 5. For many years, Final Fantasy found itself on the periphery, burdened by the very ideals that once pushed the franchise to the forefront of gaming. Final Fantasy XVI was developed with the idea of challenging those notions, as the team attempted to address wider concerns about what a Final Fantasy game should be in the modern era. And they did so in the way they hoped should allow the game to cater to existing audiences, but perhaps more importantly, also appeal to new audiences. For this reason, they chose to lean far more into the action role-playing genre than any previous mainline game, with the notion of a party being diminished much more so than even Final Fantasy XV. They also decided to take an English-first approach, having the base story rewritten to have English be the main source of truth, with voiceover in that region even taking precedence over the Japanese version. Many of these decisions led to some fantastic results, but the final product didn't quite have the cohesion that long-term fans were after. In the build-up, Naoki Yoshida, who served as the producer, highlighted that Final Fantasy XVI was akin to a roller coaster, and in many ways that analogy was perhaps too perfect, as the highs of Final Fantasy XVI were up there with some of the biggest highs in the history of gaming, but the lows that preceded and then followed these highs made the pacing feel a bit unbalanced to some. It meant that while there was a lot to like about Final Fantasy XVI, the small missteps meant it didn't quite match up with the wider expectations that people had, perhaps suggesting that they had pinned their hopes too much on Creative Business Unit 3 replicating the phenomenal success that they had had with Final Fantasy XIV. Still, even though the game provided, and still continues to provide, a lot of discourse within the community, only 4% of people who took the survey scored it as a 1 out of 5, while 41% gave it a perfect score. The other interesting point, however, is that only around 2/3 of people who took the survey had actually played the game. Those who did also gave their thoughts, and by and large they were positive. They described the game as epic, beautiful, and dark. But there were also those who felt the game was boring, shallow, and repetitive. In 9th position is another recently released game, but its position is perhaps surprising given its designation as not just a spin-off, but also a music rhythm game. Theatrhythm Final Barline scored 4.05 out of 5, and it's something of an enigma in many ways, as it wasn't even ever supposed to exist. Similar to the Dissidia franchise, after the release of Theatrhythm Curtain Call on the Nintendo 3DS, Tetsuya Nomura was not keen for the franchise to continue anymore under its current guise, as there was a feeling they had taken the concept as far as they could, and that any further expansion could be facilitated via downloadable content. However, after the success of Dissidia in arcades, Ichiro Hazama felt encouraged to explore the creation of a similar type of supporting experience for Theatrhythm. What became known as Theatrhythm Final Fantasy All-Star Carnival was designed as an even more comprehensive experience than Curtain Call, as they hoped it would appeal to arcade rhythm game enthusiasts. As such, it was designed with an enhanced and innovative control system called the Joy Slider, and it introduced an array of new elements such as online cooperative play and the ability for a huge volume of characters and enemies to appear on screen. The plan was for only 80 tracks to be included at launch, much less than was seen within Curtain Call, but this number would increase with regular updates. And as All-Star Carnival enjoyed continued success, its library of songs was expanded to include arrangements from the likes of Record Keeper, as well as music from non-Final Fantasy games such as Chrono Trigger, Romancing Saga, and even Live Alive. With so much work having gone into this production, after the release of Kingdom Hearts Melody of Memory, the team then set to work on creating a brand new version of Theatrhythm that was designed to serve as a collective work, in terms of the design principles they had adopted, but also the music they featured. Its name, Final Barline, was also meant to signify that this game would very much be the final entry in the franchise, with its release systems meaning it could be enjoyed for at least another 5 to 10 years, but who honestly knows at this point? It was lauded for its inclusivity and accessibility, catering to the hardcore and novices, while also offering a huge volume of tracks that scratched the itch from across the franchise and beyond. Season passes were also periodically released that introduced music from other Square Enix franchises and Final Fantasy XVI. But following the release of the third expansion, it appears as though long-term support for the game has now ceased. Still, with over 400 tracks to choose from and plenty of unique melodies, it's easy to see why Final Barline occupied this position on the list. In 8th position, we have another major Final Fantasy spin-off, Final Fantasy Tactics, which scored 4.08 out of 5. Even though Mystic Quest takes the moniker of being the first major non-numbered Final Fantasy game outside of the Saga and Mana offshoots, it was still stylistically very similar to the mainline entries. But Sakaguchi felt that Final Fantasy was much more adaptive, and when overseeing development of Final Fantasy VI, he started to create basic design documents around a version of Final Fantasy that was much more tactical. Those plans, unfortunately, got shelved as Final Fantasy VI and then Chrono Trigger ended up demanding too much of his time. But that's where fortune played its hand. After gaining a reputation for creating expansive and innovative tactical role-playing games at Quest, like Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre, a young creator called Yasumi Matsuno felt he may benefit from a new working environment and applied for a job at Square. Impressed by his list of credits, Sakaguchi realized that Matsuno was the perfect fit to realize his vision for melding Final Fantasy with the tactical role-playing genre. And such was Sakaguchi's confidence in the vision that Hiroyuki Ito was assigned to assist with production instead of being assigned to Final Fantasy VII. Together, Ito and Matsuno worked on crafting a new kind of experience, and central to this was the fictional world of Ivalice. It was designed to be a world the likes of which had never been seen before in a video game setting, as magic and machines were planned to coexist despite there being a distinct medieval feel. This world was then to be complemented by a unique blend of features, which saw the traditional Final Fantasy elements such as chocobos and crystals fused with original concepts. Within this world, Matsuno then wanted to tell a story that not only had a strong focus on character development, but also a serious, gritty realism. Unlike the traditional Final Fantasy narrative, which often focused around humanity fighting against monsters and supernatural beings, Matsuno envisioned a narrative that centered around humanity fighting amongst itself. And to ensure it was compelling and fleshed out, more than 80 unique characters were created, each of which were tied to one another through a complicated web of relationships that were much deeper than characters simply being friends or siblings. Alongside this, Ito worked to modify the traditional ATB system to this new tactical setting, creating the charge time battle system. And to work in with a narrative which focused on breaking down barriers that existed within society, Ito developed an evolved job system so that any character could be useful no matter what their class or social standing said about them. By the end of development, Matsuno, Ito, and the rest of the team had taken elements from the Ogre Battle saga and previous Final Fantasy games and crafted something new that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before within the role-playing genre. And when Tactics launched, the reception was very positive, not just in Japan, but also in North America. There was an appreciation that Square had created something truly special, a Final Fantasy spin-off that offered a unique experience while respectfully incorporating many traditional elements from across the franchise, and that very much came through in this survey. In 7th position, we have Final Fantasy XIV. But had the survey run 10 years ago, there's no way it would have received 4.11 out of 5. You see, after the considerable success of Final Fantasy XI, Square Enix were keen to continue their rise and assert themselves as a major player in the MMORPG space. And they sought to do this by creating a brand new game that they hoped could first coexist with Final Fantasy XI before then replacing it. The only challenge was that creating an MMORPG successor was venturing into uncharted waters, as only a few had ever even existed, such as Lineage 2 and EverQuest 2, and neither had managed to exceed the subscriber base of their predecessors. Square Enix must have been aware of these results, but decided to plough ahead anyway, as they wanted to tell a new story and show off their technical chops while doing so. Initial planning began in 2005, and the project was codenamed Rapture, and many of the staff who created Final Fantasy XI occupied the same leadership roles. Together, they sought to create a more dynamic world that became known as Hydaelyn, and extensive details were created relating to relationships with other planets and ecosystems, as well as its climate and geography. The developers also wanted the world to feel rich and diverse, so that when players explored, they never felt a sense of monotony. But they also wanted there to be a sense of familiarity, especially for players they hoped would move over from Final Fantasy XI, so they made sure that all the player races were influenced by what came before. Rapture was unveiled as Final Fantasy XIV to shocked audiences at E3 2009, but once people started to get their hands on the game, it became clear that Square Enix had bitten off more than they could chew. The development team had failed to adjust to the changing demands of developing video games and approached the game in the same way they had approached Final Fantasy XI. They spent far too much time trying to attain certain levels of graphical fidelity, often to a fault, and this led to compromises that conflicted with their vision of reducing monotony. At launch, Final Fantasy XIV subsequently featured numerous technical issues, and it became clear the team had also not kept up to date with emerging trends in the genre. Such was the backlash that the majority of the leadership team were removed from their roles, and the PlayStation 3 version of the game was delayed indefinitely. Paid subscriptions were also suspended until further notice, costing the company millions in revenue. Fortunately, there was one man within Square Enix who had a vision for how Final Fantasy XIV could be brought back from the brink, and that man was Naoki Yoshida. After speaking to Yoichi Wada, Yoshida decided to create a task force that had the sole objective of attempting to turn Final Fantasy XIV into a quality service, making the vow that everything they did would be for the players. After spending time with developers and experiencing the game firsthand, the task force quickly realized that Final Fantasy XIV featured fundamental design flaws, and no matter how much they patched up the original game, it was never going to get to a state where the majority of people were satisfied. Due to how deep-rooted the issues were, the only viable solution was to rebuild the entire game from the ground up. But this needed to be done while the original version was still running. This was a monumental undertaking, but it turned out to be the correct decision. When Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn launched in August of 2013, there was again a rocky start. But by the end of the year, everything had started to stabilize, and there became a general appreciation for the Herculean task that Yoshida and the wider development team had not only undertaken, but delivered in a way that far exceeded expectations. And with each new patch, the developers showed players more and more about their true vision for the game. However, it wasn't until the release of the game's first expansion, Heavensward, that the vision started to manifest into something much more tangible. With each new wave of major patch updates released in between the now heralded expansions that followed, that notion only continued to permeate amongst the fanbase. There was considerable praise upon the launch of Stormblood in 2017, and 2 years later, Shadowbringers raised the bar yet again, turning Final Fantasy XIV into a wholly compelling MMORPG that had now become a leading player in the space. Endwalker then served as a fitting conclusion to that original vision for Final Fantasy XIV, but with Dawntrail leading the now venerable MMO down a new path, the future still seems bright for Square Enix's flagship property. When asked to condense their thoughts, there was a mixture of sentiments. Some focused on the game's qualities, while others focused on how it made them feel. On a positive note, this meant that people said the game was fun, had a strong sense of community, and helped them build friendships. On the other side though, and there weren't too many consistent negative thoughts, people said the game was too long, tedious, and too expensive. In 6th position, we have Final Fantasy IX with a score of 4.36 out of 5. For those that came into the franchise via the PlayStation era, Final Fantasy IX was a very different type of game. But that was the intention from the start, as Hironobu Sakaguchi wanted Final Fantasy IX to serve as something of a love letter to everything that had come before, with a specific focus on reconnecting with fans from the 8-bit and 16-bit era that may have become a bit disillusioned. That same sentiment also applied to those who worked on the game too. There was an appreciation that, due to the level of ambition Square had shown with Final Fantasy VII and 8, there had been a rapid increase in the size of development teams required to ship each game. This approach required a different kind of work ethic that was a far cry from the olden days, where a small, tight-knit team would work together to create games on the Famicom and Super Famicom. Sakaguchi felt he wanted to do an equivalent of getting the band back together. So he installed Hiroyuki Ito as director and placed staff members like Kazuhiko Aoki, Hideo Minaba, Kazuko Shibuya, and Hirokatsu Sasaki into senior positions, hoping to leverage their experiences working on the franchise in the pre-PlayStation era. Many were not involved with Final Fantasy VIII, and it allowed the games to be worked on in tandem, with development of Final Fantasy IX starting 9 months before work on 8 had wrapped up. Due to this shift in focus throughout development, there was a sentiment that perhaps Final Fantasy IX was too different from the direction the franchise had been taking, and that it would be better placed off as a spin-off akin to Mystic Quest or Tactics. However, after careful consideration, they decided that despite how much of a departure it was, this game should still be a numbered title, as it featured so many quintessential Final Fantasy elements. Those elements combined should have set up Final Fantasy IX to perform well upon its release, but even though it received a ton of positive praise, sales failed to match what had been achieved by its predecessors. However, when viewed through the lens of it being a follow-up to Final Fantasy VI as opposed to 7 and 8, its performance was very strong. And regardless, it was a fitting way for the franchise to say goodbye to the original PlayStation, a console that had helped to launch Final Fantasy on a global scale and cement the brand as one of the most influential in gaming history. When asking people for their thoughts, the most common sentiments were that Final Fantasy IX was charming, emotional, and nostalgic, and Vivi was also called out specifically as a positive. But on the other side, there were those who felt the game was slow and boring. However, it should be stated that there were almost no negative sentiments. In 5th position is Final Fantasy VI with a score of 4.40 out of 5. Final Fantasy VI arrived at an interesting time for the franchise. After being influential for so long, Sakaguchi was promoted to the role of Executive Vice President at Square. It was a fitting reward for someone who had done probably more than anyone else at the company to help shape its fortunes. However, with the role change also came a big change in responsibilities. Up until that point, Sakaguchi had been very focused on the Final Fantasy franchise and ensuring it was at the peak of its powers. He'd overseen huge changes in approach, while also making sure each game felt inherently Final Fantasy. And although his role within the development team had been required to change as more and more people became involved, he still tried to stay in the trenches as much as possible, as shown by his heavy involvement in the scenario and script writing for Final Fantasy V. Being an executive vice president, however, required Sakaguchi to take on a very different role, as he was now expected to look at the big picture of Final Fantasy and the company as a whole. So after coming up with the initial concept of Final Fantasy VI and serving as the chief architect, he handed over directorial responsibilities to the two individuals he'd worked closest with on Final Fantasy V, Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito. Much like on Final Fantasy V, two distinct teams were formed, with one relating to game design and battle systems, and another relating to scenario and all aspects of presentation. Ito helmed the first team, and Kitase helmed the second team. But as they were now given additional responsibilities as leaders, they each put their own stamp on things. It saw numerous innovations taken with regards to storytelling and gameplay, but it also extended to other areas as well, with Uematsu vowing to make its soundtrack so special that he could look back on his career with no regrets. Needless to say, the approach worked. For many, Final Fantasy VI is up there with some of the best titles ever released during the 16-bit era and video gaming in general. But whereas in Japan it sold well and exceeded the performance of Final Fantasy V, its performance in North America, where it was released as Final Fantasy III, was more lukewarm, and it led to Sakaguchi later declaring his surprise when he learned it had developed such a loyal following overseas. When asking people for their thoughts, the most common positive sentiments related to the cast of characters, Kefka, and its music. Of the few negative comments, the only one that really stood out was overhyped. Fourth on this list is another recent title. Yes, it's Final Fantasy VII Remake with a score of 4.45 out of 5. Ever since the Final Fantasy VII technical demo, which was shown off at E3 2005, there has been an outpouring of intrigue around what a potential full-on remake of Final Fantasy VII may look like. In the decade that followed, senior figures at Square Enix were continually asked about when they were planning to remake Final Fantasy VII, and each time they had to be polite with their response, denying such a project existed or had the potential to exist. That was until 2015, 10 years after the original technical demo had been shown off to the world. As part of a bumper E3 PlayStation press conference, Square Enix showcased a teaser that confirmed they were working on a Final Fantasy VII remake, and that it would be overseen by many of the original creators, including Yoshinori Kitase, who was to serve as producer, and Tetsuya Nomura, who had been installed as director. It's not an understatement to say that the trailer sent shockwaves throughout the gaming world, and it quickly became the most talked about occurrence at the venerable trade show. However, in the years that followed, everything got a bit confusing. This started when the remake was announced as being just the first game in a multi-part series, and it was then further compounded by news that the game was nowhere near ready and had been announced early as a marketing tactic to encourage gamers to buy PlayStation 4s ahead of the releases of Final Fantasy XV and Kingdom Hearts 3. Nonetheless, 4 years later, when the game was shown off again in earnest, fans were impressed by what was being showcased. And when the game then launched, there were numerous plaudits for its modern gameplay system and reworked soundtrack. Fans also learnt, however, that it was not a one-to-one narrative remake. The creators had chosen to modify the story, and the game's conclusion ended up being a particular point of contention. That created a certain amount of intrigue amongst the fanbase, and it teed everything up nicely for the next installment. In third position, we have another game from the so-called golden era of the franchise, as Final Fantasy X scored 4.5 out of 5. And this is an important point to emphasize, as it means only 3 games in the entire survey were given the equivalent of a 9 out of 10 or higher. This then highlights just how hard the fanbase can be to please, and the difficult task Square Enix often faces when attempting to create new installments in the franchise. We're apparently a hard bunch of people to impress, as shown by our collective thoughts determining that only 3 games can be considered top draw across the entire franchise. Final Fantasy X, however, received almost unanimous praise, and it's still beloved even today, as shown by the quite ridiculous sales figures associated to the Final Fantasy X 10.2 HD Remaster project. What's perhaps most interesting, though, is how the game even came to be. Having been involved with the Final Fantasy franchise since Final Fantasy V, when Final Fantasy VIII wrapped up, Kitase was given some room to explore ideas outside of the franchise, and this led to the creation of a project called 17. Kitase envisioned a world that had been ravaged by a plague which ended the lives of people when they turned 17. Its story revolved around 2 characters who, having learnt the truth about the plague and its origins, embarked on a quest to try and find a cure. It's unclear when 17 transitioned over to being Final Fantasy X, but when the game was announced during the Square Millennium event, a bold new vision was presented when compared to the previous generation of games. It featured fully realised 3D environments, voice acting, and a whole new suite of physics-based interactions that could be applied to characters. There were even plans for a controllable camera that would allow players to focus in on the many details that existed in each scene. Many of these ambitions were quite lofty, and concessions ultimately had to be made when the development team realised they couldn't push the PlayStation 2 hardware as much as they wanted. Final Fantasy X also suffered a delay, something that had never publicly happened before to a Final Fantasy game. But when it launched, records tumbled as it became the first PlayStation 2 game to sell 2 million copies, and then 4 million copies. In terms of why, the most common positive descriptors were the emotional weight of the game and its beauty. But on the flip side, perhaps due to how much this aspect was put in the spotlight following the release of Final Fantasy XIII, linearity was brought up as one of the main negatives. In second place is the most recent major iteration in the franchise, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, with a score of 4.57 out of 5. After the conclusion of Final Fantasy VII Remake, there were so many questions about what was next, and this related to not just the story, but also how the game was going to be represented once the party had escaped Midgar and left behind the dank and dingy slums to embark on the quest around the world. For some time, fans were left to wait, kept occupied by the PC launch of Remake and the release of Interlude and Intermission. But news was still delivered, such as Naoki Hamaguchi replacing Tetsuya Nomura as director, and confirmation that certain characters will be appearing in the next installment. During the Final Fantasy VII 25th Anniversary Celebration livestream, some of the lingering questions around story direction were then answered, as the teaser was shown that featured Cloud, Sephiroth, and Zack. What followed was copious amounts of speculation about what may happen next and how it may manifest. And this related to not just the story, but also gameplay due to potential characters who could be implemented. As launch got closer, the speculations and theories then only grew in their scope and spectacle. When Rebirth then did launch, the game fans were greeted with made Remake feel like something akin to a technical demo. Gone were all the restrictions and limitations, as players were able to explore a densely populated world with copious amounts of side quests and mini-games to keep them occupied. New playable characters also had well thought out and purposeful gameplay styles that complemented existing characters while making them feel unique. While there are still some question marks around how the story concluded, it did little to diminish the quality of the overall product, and this has led to a lot of anticipation to see if Square Enix can raise the bar again as the multi-part series comes to an epic conclusion in the third part. That then brings us to the game which topped the charts, scoring 0.01 higher than second place. Yes, Final Fantasy VII was the number one game with a score of 4.58 out of 5. When Final Fantasy VI was released, it was perceived to be the new pinnacle of the franchise, and in Japan at least, one of the greatest role-playing games ever created. Figuring out how to try and surpass that was no easy task, and there ended up being many false dawns throughout development as the company wrestled with attempting to salvage projects that were struggling. One such project, Chrono Trigger, ended up surpassing Final Fantasy VI in terms of its critical accolades, and with it also featuring an all-star cast of developers, it placed even more pressure on the next major Final Fantasy installment. But by the time Chrono Trigger had launched, the landscape had also changed, and at the start of 1996, Square announced via a TV commercial that they were going to be developing games for the PlayStation, and that Final Fantasy VII was to be an exclusive game on that system. Square had seen something with that technology that they believed could push role-playing games to the next level, and with full belief that their vision could be delivered upon, Yoshinori Kitase was backed with funding that helped him to construct what, at the time, was one of the largest video game development teams ever assembled. Together, they toiled away for around a year to create this bold, new vision to Final Fantasy. But it was fraught with risk, not least because they had the potential to alienate the existing fanbase that they had spent the best part of a decade developing. Upon launch, Famitsu though scored the game higher than any previous entry in the franchise, and it sold over 2 million copies in its first week on sale in Japan. There were, of course, those who were hurt by the huge changes Square had made, but they were quickly replaced by countless new fans who were desperate to experience what was, to many at the time, a phenomenal game. In the West, outside of the original Final Fantasy, which saw modest returns, Final Fantasy VII was a game changer. The North American launch was supported by a huge marketing campaign which positioned Final Fantasy VII as a killer app for the PlayStation, And it was so strong that even though Square had made the decision to ditch their alternate numbering convention and stick with the Japanese numbering, it made no difference at all. Sony felt the game had the potential to sell around 750,000 copies across its lifetime in North America, but it managed to sell just over 1 million in 3 months, and it was a similar story when the game launched in Europe. Over the past 2 decades, there has always been a lot of debate around whether Final Fantasy VII deserves its place at the top of the tree, but its impact on the trajectory of the franchise cannot be denied. And when it launched, publications ran out of superlatives. GameFan called it the greatest entertainment product ever created, stating it was a prime candidate for being the perfect video game. Game Informer called it the best RPG ever made, and GameSpot said it would rank as one of the best games you would ever play in your lifetime. Since then, times have of course changed, and nostalgia plays a part. But Final Fantasy VII stands as an iconic and impactful game that so far has yet to be surpassed. When surmising the thoughts of the community, there were of course many common phrases such as iconic, groundbreaking, epic, and masterpiece. And as you might expect, they were counterbalanced by one word: overrated. That, however, completes this very long and exhausting list. If you're still listening, I'd like to thank you for your continued support. We are incredibly fortunate to have people like you in our corner, and we also receive funding from numerous people on Patreon and YouTube memberships, which goes a long way to helping to produce videos like this. Benjamin Snow, Christopher M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Christopher Milstead, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory, Endog Snake, Stephen, and Zukin TDK stand tall as special Onion Knight supporters, but we are so grateful to them and all of the names you're seeing right now. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.